Hi there. If you're already curled up somewhere warm right now, blanket pulled up to your chin, phone propped against a pillow in the dark, hello, I'm really glad you found your way here tonight. Maybe you had a long day. Maybe your body's tired, but your mind will not quite slow down yet. Either way, come sit with me for a while. Tonight we're going somewhere cold, somewhere far back in time, and somewhere a lot stranger than you might expect. In the winter of 1692, in a small farming village in Massachusetts, two little girls began screaming, and they could not stop. Within months, 20 people would be dead, hundreds more would spend the rest of their days afraid, and almost everything you think you know about what happened next. The burnings, the broomsticks, the black cats, none of it is true. Tonight we go back to the real beginning, the one almost nobody tells you about. But before we step into that cold little village together, I want to ask you for something small. If quiet, slow, true stories like this one are the kind of thing that helps your mind finally settle down at night, it would mean a lot if you tapped that subscribe button and maybe left a like on your way out. It helps this little space keep going more than you would probably think. And if you have a second, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is right where you are. I always like knowing who is out there in the dark with me. Some of you are getting ready for bed. Some of you just got off a long shift and are winding down. I would love to hear from you either way. Now go ahead. Turn the lights down low if you can. Maybe click on a fan or a heat or something with a soft, steady hum in the background. It always makes these old stories feel a little more real. Get comfortable, and let's begin. Picture a village small enough that you could walk from one end of it to the other before your tea got cold. Wooden houses with steep sloped roofs built to shrug off heavy snow. Smoke rising straight up from stone chimneys into a sky the colour of an old bruise. This is Salem Village, part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Not the busy shop-lined Salem you might picture today with its ghost tours and its souvenir shops. That town full of ships and merchants and money was Salem Town a few miles down a frozen dirt road. Salem Village was smaller, poorer. Mostly farmland mud paths and one plain meeting house where every single person in the community gathered twice on a Sunday, whether they wanted to or not. Past the last farmhouse, the fields simply stop and the tree line begins, dark tangled and to a Puritan mind never entirely empty. In a world without street lamps or telephones or locked doors that actually kept much of anything out, the edge of the forest was where the known world ended and something else, something unnamed, was believed to begin. It is January in the year 1692, and inside one particular house, the parsonage home of the village minister, something is about to happen that nobody, not one single soul, is ready for. The minister was a man named Samuel Parris, stern, a little proud if we're being honest, and not especially loved by his own congregation. Some of the villagers already thought he preached more about money and respect than about mercy. In his house lived his wife, Elizabeth, his young daughter Betty, who was 9 years old, and his niece Abigail, who had just turned 11. There was also a woman in the household named Tituba, enslaved by the Parris family along with her husband. Little is written about where exactly she came from, though most historians place her origins somewhere in the Caribbean. She ran that kitchen, kept that fire fed through the coldest nights, and likely knew those two girls better than almost anyone else in the house. We're going to spend a lot more time with her very soon, because what happens to her is one of the strangest and saddest threads in this entire story. But for right now, let's just sit in that kitchen for a moment. Winters in Puritan New England were long, dark, and almost aggressively boring. I mean that quite literally. No theatre, no dancing, since dancing was considered one short step from sin. No card games, no music, just for pleasure, almost nothing that could honestly be called fun. Because in a world where the devil was believed to be real and near and always watching for an opening, fun itself felt a little suspicious. Bedtime came early, mostly because candles were expensive and firewood did not split itself. Chores started before sunrise and prayer book ended every single meal. If you're picturing a childhood with none of the noise or colour we take for granted now, you're picturing it correctly. On a truly wild Tuesday, a child might get to hold the good sewing scissors. So what did two young girls do? Shut inside a small dark house for weeks at a time with nothing but chores and scripture to fill the hours. Much of what we know about this next part comes from a minister named John Hale who lived nearby, watched these events unfold with his own eyes, and later wrote one of the first full accounts of what happened in Salem. According to Hale, some of the local girls had quietly started experimenting with a homemade kind of fortune-telling. They would crack an egg, drop the white of it into a glass of water, and study the shapes it made, hoping to catch a glimpse of what trade their future husband might have. A small candlelit game passed between friends, the sort of thing their parents would have been horrified to discover. One night, Hale wrote one of the girls looked into that glass, and she did not see a farmer, or a carpenter, or a fisherman. She saw the shape of a coffin, and that quietly almost nowhere near a courtroom is where the fear actually begins. Not with an accusation, not with a trial, with a group of bored, isolated, imaginative young girls, frightening themselves half to death by candlelight with absolutely no safe way to talk about it afterward. Because in their world, admitting you had tried a little fortune-telling meant admitting you had opened a door, even a small one, straight toward the devil. Nobody blew out the candle right away, or so the story goes. Nobody said a word for a long moment. And whatever passed between those girls in that kitchen that night, they carried it quietly without telling a single adult what they had done or what they thought they had seen. Some fear, if you let it sit long enough in silence, does not fade. It just waits for a reason to come back out. Weeks passed, and sometime in the middle of that January, Betty Paris started acting strange. Not dramatic, not at first. A little distant, a little quiet. She would stare at nothing for long stretches of time, forget what she was doing halfway through a simple chore, flinch hard at sounds no one else in the room seemed to hear. Then it got worse. Betty began crawling under the furniture, twisting her small body into shapes that made the adults around her deeply uncomfortable to watch. She complained of being pinched and bitten by something nobody else could see. She would scream suddenly without warning in the middle of a completely quiet room, and sometimes the sounds coming out of her were not really words at all. Sometimes they sounded closer to an animal than to a 9-year-old girl. Elizabeth Paris tried rocking her daughter, praying over her, holding her small wrist still until the fit passed. Word travelled fast in a village that small. Soon enough, neighbours were showing up at the parsonage door after dark, candles in hand, standing quietly in the front room, while the minister prayed out loud over his shaking child, no one quite sure what they were watching or what to do about it. Abigail started showing the very same signs not long after. Now, if this happened in a house down your street today, you would probably know exactly what to do. Call for real medical help. Think seizure, maybe. Think fever or shock or something psychological brought on by fear and stress, and you would not be wrong to consider any of those. But this was 1692. There was no such thing as child psychology yet. Medicine in the way we understand it now barely existed at all. So Reverend Paris did the only thing that made sense to a frightened father in his position. He sent for the village doctor, a man named William Griggs. Dr. Griggs examined both girls carefully. He checked for fever. He checked for any injury, any obvious illness, anything a physician of his time might recognize. He pressed a hand to each small forehead, watched their eyes, waited through one of the fits himself, standing perfectly still in a room gone silent except for a child's ragged breathing, and he found nothing, no fever, no wound, no visible cause for any of it. So he offered the only explanation that fit inside his own understanding of the world. He told Reverend Paris that his daughter and his niece were under an evil hand. Somebody somewhere was using witchcraft against those two little girls. I want you to sit with that phrase for just a second. An evil hand. A quiet sentence spoken calmly by a village doctor who truly believed he was offering a real medical opinion. That one sentence would end up costing 20 people their lives, and it would leave a scar on this small community that is honestly still visible today, more than 300 years later. Reverend Parris did what a minister of his time was expected to do with a crisis like this one. He turned to prayer and he called in help. Neighbouring ministers were invited to the parsonage for a full day of fasting and prayer, hoping that enough faith spoken loudly enough might drive whatever this was out of his daughter and his niece for good. It did not work. I think about that a lot, honestly. A room full of grown adults, all of them intelligent, all of them faithful, all of them doing exactly what their world had taught them to do in a crisis, and not one of them had a framework for what was actually happening, whatever that might have been. Fear, grief, trauma, plain childhood mischief that had spun wildly out of control. We have words for all of that now. They only had one word available to them: witchcraft. Word spread through Salem village almost overnight, and here is the part that should really unsettle you. Betty and Abigail were not the last girls to start behaving this way. Within a matter of weeks, other young women in the village, including a 12-year-old girl named Ann Putnam, began showing the very same symptoms. The same fits, the same screaming, the same claims of being pinched and bitten by something invisible. A small private frightened moment in one minister's kitchen was quietly turning into something much bigger, and very soon somebody was going to have to answer for it. Here is where most people already think they know this story. The witch hunt, the trials, the burning at the stake, except nobody in Salem was ever burned, not one single person. What actually happened to the people accused in this village is in some ways even harder to sit with, and we will get there together, I promise. But before we can talk about who Salem accused, and why and how an entire court system built and run by educated God-fearing men ended up sending women in their 70s and respected church members to the gallows right alongside beggars and outcasts, we need to understand something first. We need to understand exactly what kind of place Salem Village already was in the months and years before two bored little girls ever dropped an egg white into a glass of water. Because the fear that eventually killed 20 people did not begin in that parsonage kitchen. It had already been building quietly for a long time before that. Somewhere out past the tree line, past the edge of everything Salem Village considered safe, something had already been shaping the fear these people carried with them every single day. Long before Betty Parris ever crawled under a table or screamed at a sound no one else could hear. Picture that candle in the parsonage window one more time, burning low snow, gathering silently against the glass. Somewhere behind that flame a village is about to turn on itself, and that is exactly where we go next. So let's rewind the clock a little. Not by centuries, just by a handful of years and a few hundred miles north to a stretch of coastline most people watching this have never once heard of. Because here is something almost nobody tells you about Salem. By the time those two little girls started screaming in that parsonage kitchen, the colony around them had not had a properly working government for nearly 3 years. I know, not exactly the detail you would expect in a story about witches. Stay with me though, because it matters more than you might think. A few years earlier, back in 1686, the King of England had grown tired of letting his New England colonies govern themselves. He folded Massachusetts along with several of its neighbours into a single royal territory and put a hard, unpopular soldier named Edmund Andros in charge of the whole thing. Andros dismissed the local assemblies. He questioned people's land titles. He taxed a deeply religious population that had crossed an entire ocean specifically to avoid answering to a king. People hated him. So in the spring of 1689, when word reached Boston that England itself had overthrown its king, in what history now calls the Glorious Revolution, the people of Massachusetts did not wait for permission. A crowd rose up in the streets of Boston, seized Andros and threw him in a cell before the week was even out, which felt fantastic for about a day, because once the celebrating stopped, the colony realized it had a serious problem on its hands. Its old charter, the actual legal document that gave its government the right to exist in the first place, had already been cancelled by the king years before Andros ever arrived. So when the colonists tossed him out, they were not exactly restoring their government. They were running the place on memory, on habit, and on sheer stubbornness, without a single piece of paper that said any of it was still legal. Picture running your entire town, your courts, your taxes, your militia, for nearly 3 straight years purely on good intentions and the hope that nobody in London noticed. That is roughly what Massachusetts was doing. Try explaining that to a modern accountant. A brand new charter finally arrived from London in the early winter of 1692. News of it reached Boston by the end of January. The man appointed to carry it home and take charge as the colony's very first royal governor, a rough, self-made sea captain named William Phips, would not actually set foot back in Massachusetts himself until the middle of May. Which means, for the exact stretch of weeks when Betty Paris and her cousin first began to show signs that something was terribly wrong, the government of Massachusetts existed in a kind of legal fog. Old enough to remember how things used to work, too new to fully trust that they still did. There were no standing courts equipped to try a capital case that winter, no established legal process for something as serious as witchcraft. Whatever process eventually got built to handle it would have to be assembled from scratch in a hurry by men doing their best with the system that barely existed yet. We will come back to exactly what that hastily built court looked like, and it is not a flattering picture. That is not a comfortable place for a frightened community to be standing. And Massachusetts was already frightened for reasons that had almost nothing to do with witches. Up along the coast of what is now Maine, a brutal grinding conflict had been tearing through English settlements for nearly 3 years. Historians call it King William's War, part of a much larger struggle between England and France that had spilled over into their colonies across the water. On the ground in the towns and farms scattered along that northern frontier, it looked a great deal simpler than any king's ambitions back in Europe. French forces working alongside Wabanaki fighters defending land that colonists had been steadily pushing them off of for decades, were burning English settlements to the ground one after another, moving south a little further with every season. By the winter of 1692, families across Essex County had already spent 3 years listening for news from the north, the way you or I might check a weather app before a storm. Except the storm never really passed. It only ever moved to the next town over. Let me be honest with you for a second, the way I try to be with all of you. This is not a simple story of villains and innocents. Colonists had been settling further and further onto Wabanaki land for generations, breaking earlier agreements, pushing people out. What followed was a war with grievance and horror on more than one side of it. But if you were a farmer in Massachusetts in the winter of 1692, you were not thinking about any of that larger context. You were only hearing the news as it reached you, and the news that particular winter was terrifying. On the 24th of January 1692, a force of somewhere around 150 Wabanaki fighters working with French officers struck a coastal town called York. It happened at night in a snowstorm with almost no warning at all. Homes were set alight one after another along the river, the fires visible for miles in the dark. Nearly 100 English settlers were killed. Roughly 80 more, including women and small children, were taken captive and marched north through the winter woods toward Canada, as prisoners, some of them dying along the way before anyone could pay to bring them home. Entire households simply ceased to exist in the space of a single night. News like that did not stay in Maine. It travelled south by horse and by letter town to town, pulpit to pulpit, until every congregation in Essex County had heard some version of it, usually a version worse than what had actually happened. That attack on York happened 9 days before Reverend Paris sent for the village doctor. I want you to sit with that timing for a moment, because I do not think it is coincidence. and neither do several of the historians who have spent their careers studying this. A community that had just heard in vivid, horrifying detail exactly what an unstoppable, unseen enemy could do to a peaceful town in a single night was suddenly watching two little girls scream about invisible hands pinching and biting them. You do not need actual witchcraft for that combination to feel unbearable. You just need a population already primed to believe the worst thing imaginable was coming for them next. And here is the part of this story that I find honestly more heartbreaking than almost anything else in it. Those refugees from the northern frontier did not vanish after their towns burned. They went somewhere. Many of them went south into Massachusetts proper, into towns just like Salem, carrying nothing but what they could grab and whatever they had witnessed. One of them was a teenage girl named Mercy Lewis. Mercy had been born in a coastal Maine settlement called Falmouth. As a small child, and then again a few years later, Wabanaki raids tore through her family, taking her grandparents, her aunts and uncles, most of her cousins, and eventually both of her parents. By the time she was 14 years old, Mercy Lewis had survived more loss than most people experience in an entire lifetime. She was sent to work as a servant first in the household of a minister who had also lived through those same frontier attacks, a man named George Burroughs, whose name is going to come back into this story in a much bigger way before we are through. Eventually, Mercy made her way south to Salem Village, still in her teens, and took a position as a servant in the home of a farmer named Thomas Putnam. Think about what she must have carried into that house with her. Not luggage. Not even really memories in the way we usually mean that word. Something closer to a body that had learned at far too young an age exactly how quickly an ordinary evening can turn into the worst night of your life. The Putnam house was also home to a young cousin of Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, a girl named Ann Putnam, and it was in that household under that roof, surrounded by a girl who had personally watched her entire world get burned down around her, that some of the very same kind of fits and torments soon began appearing again. Mercy was not the only one either. Historians who have gone through the surviving court records name several other members of that original accusing circle who had direct family ties to the Maine frontier refugees, or the children of refugees sitting in the very same room listening to the very same news from home. This was not one traumatized girl in an otherwise calm household. It was closer to a small cluster of young women who had all in one way or another already lived through the exact kind of terror they were now describing happening to them again invisibly inside their own village. I am not a historian, and I want to be careful about drawing too straight a line here. But I do think it is worth asking yourself something. If you had watched neighbours dragged into the snow at gunpoint and buildings you knew burned to ash in a single night, and if you carried that with you every single day, with absolutely no name for it, no doctor to treat it, no framework we would now call trauma or grief or post-traumatic stress, what might your mind eventually do with all of that fear once it finally found somewhere safe enough to let it out? There is a respected historian named Mary Beth Norton who has spent a great deal of her career on exactly this question. She points out something that most popular retellings of Salem completely skip over. When the afflicted girls described the shapes tormenting them, the visions were not old European fairy tale witches on broomsticks. Several of the accusing girls described dark, fast-moving men appearing suddenly at the edge of a room, the same way an ambush appears at the edge of a field and vanishing again just as fast. Some of that testimony echoes almost word for word the language colonists used to describe the very fighters who had burned their towns. Norton is careful, and so am I to say this is not proof of anything supernatural. It might simply be proof that trauma borrows whatever language a mind already has lying around. And in Salem Village that winter the language lying around belonged to a war. Here is a question worth sitting with tonight, whatever your answer happens to be. Have you ever noticed that fear needs somewhere to go, that when people are frightened for long enough, with no real way to fight back against the actual threat, that fear does not just quietly fade away on its own. It looks for a target near enough to touch. There was one more layer to all of this, and it might be the most important one of all. The Puritans who settled Massachusetts had not crossed an ocean simply looking for opportunity. They believed with their whole hearts that they were building something almost holy. Their own leaders had called it a city upon a hill, a shining example the entire world was supposedly watching. For decades they had told themselves that if they kept their side of a sacred bargain with God, prosperity and protection would follow. By 1692, that bargain looked to a lot of frightened people like it might be falling apart. Their government had spent years without legal standing. Their frontier was on fire. Good church-going, families were burying children lost to disease and warfare in the very same season. Ministers across the colony had spent that same period preaching a very particular kind of sermon, one historians now call the Jeremiad, named for the doom-laden prophet Jeremiah. Its whole purpose was to remind a congregation that hardship was never random. If the harvest failed, if the war dragged on, if children died young, it was because the community itself had drifted from its sacred purpose and needed to repent before things got even worse. Imagine sitting in a cold, unheated meeting house every single Sunday, twice a day, hearing some version of that message for years. To a mind steeped entirely in scripture, primed for exactly that kind of thinking, there was really only one way to explain a run of misfortune that's severe. They were not simply unlucky. They believed they were being punished. And if they were being punished, that meant an enemy, a real active spiritual enemy, had to be at work somewhere nearby. Somewhere inside their own walls, and not only out there past the tree line. So by the time two little girls in a minister's kitchen started speaking of invisible hands, Salem Village did not need much convincing at all. The fear was already sitting right there, fully formed in every pew of that meeting house, just waiting for a name. It would not have to wait much longer, because here is what almost nobody stops to consider about that particular winter. It was not one crisis pressing down on Salem Village. It was three all landing at once, a government with no legal ground to stand on, a war at the edge of the world sending its most traumatized survivors straight into their front rooms, and a faith that had already taught an entire generation to see suffering as evidence of sin hiding somewhere nearby, waiting to be found and named. Take away any one of those three pressures, and this might have stayed exactly what it started as a strange, sad episode, involving two frightened children and a worried doctor. Nothing more than a single winter's bad dream forgotten within a generation, the kind of story a grandmother might mention once and never bring up again. But all three arrived together. I think about that combination a lot, honestly, and not only because I am telling you about it so late at night. Communities rarely fall apart because of one single bad thing happening to them. It is almost always several bad things arriving at once, each one making the others feel a little more unbearable. Ask anyone who has lived through a truly difficult year, and they will usually tell you the same thing. It was never just one crisis. It was everything all together, all at the same time. And within days of that doctor's diagnosis, the questioning in Salem Village would finally begin. The very first three names spoken out loud would belong to three women who on paper could not have been more different from one another. And yet underneath everything they shared exactly one thing in common. Every single person in that meeting house already had a reason ready and waiting to believe the absolute worst about each of them. Let's meet them properly then. All three of them, one at a time, exactly the way Salem Village already knew them long before anyone ever said the word witch out loud. On the 29th of February, 1692, a small group of village men walked to the local magistrate and swore out formal complaints against two women. The men were named Joseph Hutchinson, Thomas Putnam, Edward Putnam, and Thomas Preston. I want you to hold on to that last name Putnam because you are going to hear it again and again and again before this story is finished. It shows up on more of these early documents than almost any other name in Salem village. The very next morning, the 1st of March, 3 women were brought into the village meeting house to be examined. Word had already spread overnight the way it always does in a place that small. By the time the magistrates arrived, the room was packed shoulder to shoulder, freezing cold despite the crowd and loud with whispering. Farmers who should have been out working their frozen fields had left them to stand in that room instead. The afflicted girl sat right there in front of everyone, near enough to see every flinch on the accused women's faces, ready to react the moment each one walked through the door. Let's start with the one everybody in town already had an opinion about. Her name was Sarah Good, and by the winter of 1692 she was in the plainest terms destitute. Her father had actually been a reasonably prosperous innkeeper until he drowned himself when Sarah was still a teenager. Her mother remarried quickly, and Sarah and her sisters spent years fighting mostly without success for the inheritance that should have been theirs. Her first husband died and left her nothing but his debts. Her second husband, a labourer named William Good, could rarely find steady work. By the time their daughter Dorothy was born, the family had lost their home entirely, so Sarah Good did the only thing left to her. She walked from door to door with her small daughter asking neighbours for food, for shelter, for a little work. And here is the detail that more than anything else sealed her fate. When people turned her away, which happened often, she reportedly did not simply leave quietly. She muttered as she walked off, under her breath, half to herself, clearly irritated. Think about how that would have looked to a suspicious, frightened community. A homeless woman shows up at your door, you refuse her, and she turns and mutters something you cannot quite make out as she walks away. Was she cursing you? Praying? Simply venting the way any exhausted, humiliated person might? It did not matter. In Salem village that winter, muttering was evidence. When Sarah Good stood before the magistrates that morning, she denied everything flatly and without apology. Asked what she said under her breath to people who refused her charity, she claimed it was only the Lord's Prayer or a psalm, nothing more. Asked whether she hurt the children, she said she did not. Pressed further, she suggested it might have been Sarah Osborne doing the hurting instead. Whatever else you want to say about Sarah Good, she does not appear from the surviving record to have been a woman easily frightened into silence. Officers who later escorted her back and forth to jail described her as sharp-tongued and openly hostile toward the magistrates, a woman who fought back with the only weapon left available to someone in her position, her voice. There is something almost admirable in that even now, even knowing exactly where her story was heading. Which brings us to the second woman brought in that morning. Sarah Osborne was on the surface almost nothing like Sarah Good. Older, frail, chronically ill for nearly a year, to the point where she had truly stopped attending Sunday worship, which in Salem village was not a small thing to notice. Regular church attendance was not optional. It was closer to a civic requirement, and a woman who had quietly stopped showing up for whatever reason was already living slightly outside the bounds of respectable behaviour. Osborne had also scandalised a few of her neighbours years earlier by living with a man before formally marrying him, an indentured servant named Alexander Osborne. And underneath all of that, there was a bitter ongoing dispute over land and inheritance between Osborne and a powerful local family, a conflict tied to money that was legally meant to pass to her own sons. We're going to come back to exactly how much that kind of dispute mattered in Salem village, because it mattered far more than most people realise. For right now, just remember that Sarah Osborne too had made herself a handful of quiet enemies long before anyone whispered the word witchcraft anywhere near her name. Like good Osborne denied every accusation. She had never hurt those children. She barely knew some of them. The magistrates were not satisfied. Neither was the crowd. Step back for a second and look at what Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne actually had in common, because it is not what you might expect. They were not friends. They likely were not even familiar acquaintances. What connected them was something quieter and in its own way far more dangerous. Both women had at some point stopped fitting neatly into the shape Salem Village expected a respectable woman to take. One had fallen out of the economy entirely begging at doors that used to belong to families much like her own. The other had fallen out of the church absent from a pew that everyone else in the room could see was empty. In a community that measured a person's worth almost entirely by their visible participation in faith and order, both women had without meaning to made themselves conspicuous simply by falling behind, which leaves the third name on that warrant, and here honestly is where this story stops being simply sad and becomes something closer to horrifying. Her name was Tituba, and she was enslaved in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris. Most historians now believe Tituba was originally from an Arawak community somewhere along the coast of what is today Venezuela, captured as a child carried to Barbados, and sold there as a teenager likely to Parris or one of his business partners. From Barbados she was brought north first to Boston and eventually to Salem Village, where she cooked, cleaned, and helped raise Betty Parris and Abigail Williams, almost as if they were her own. If you go looking, you will still find plenty of old retellings describing her as some kind of voodoo priestess who taught the local girls dark magic. There is really no solid evidence at all for that particular version of her story. It says a great deal more about who got to write history for the next 300 years than it does about who Tituba actually was. What we do know is this. A few weeks earlier, a neighbour named Mary Sibley had suggested a folk remedy to try and help Betty and Abigail. Bake what was called a witch cake made from rye flour, mixed with the afflicted girl's own urine, and feed it to a dog. If the dog reacted strangely, that would supposedly reveal who was tormenting them. I will let that recipe speak for itself. Somewhere between medicine and mischief, and not something I would recommend trying at home then or now. Tituba, likely under pressure from someone in the household, went along with it, and helped prepare the cake. Reverend Parris was furious when he found out. To him this was not harmless folk medicine. It was the exact kind of dabbling in the occult his own church existed to prevent. And it was shortly after that discovery that suspicion in the household turned squarely onto Tituba herself. By her own account given years later to a man named Robert Califf, who wrote one of the earliest critical histories of these trials, Tituba said that Parris beat her until she gave him the confession he wanted to hear. I want to sit with that for a second, because it rarely gets said plainly enough. The first confession of the entire Salem Witch Trials, the testimony that convinced an already terrified village that the devil truly had arrived among them, may well have started as a beating administered by a minister to an enslaved woman in his own kitchen. And once that confession began, it did not stop. Tituba told the magistrates that a tall man dressed in black had come to her asking her to sign his book. She described a great black dog low and silent at the edge of her vision, a hog, a red cat and a black cat prowling in and out of the room as she spoke, a yellow bird perched somewhere just out of reach. She spoke of riding through the night air on sticks alongside other witches moving above the treetops, while the village slept beneath her, and she named the two women sitting right beside her, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, as being part of it. She said there were more witches still out there, though she claimed she could not say who. It was by any honest measure an extraordinary performance, whether shaped by genuine terror, calculated survival instinct, or more likely both at once. Picture the room while she spoke. Grown men leaning forward, afflicted girls suddenly still. A minister watching a woman he had beaten only days before spin out a vision of the devil, vivid enough to convince an entire congregation that hell itself had opened somewhere nearby. And it worked exactly the way fear tends to work in a room full of already frightened people. According to one account written down that very day, the moment Tituba finally began to confess the girls who'd been writhing and screaming throughout the entire examination suddenly almost eerily went quiet. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. If you had been standing in that cold meeting house, and you watched an entire room of tormented screaming children fall silent the instant a confession began, would you have needed anything more to convince you that something real was happening? Now here is the part of this story I think about more than almost anything else in the entire Salem case, and it is a detail that most retellings skip right past. Tituba confessed and she survived. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne denied everything, and their lives were about to be measured very differently because of it. Historians who have gone through the surviving court records have noticed a pattern that holds up almost without exception across the entire crisis that followed. The people who eventually confessed to witchcraft, no matter how outlandish their confession sounded, were with only the rarest exception spared execution. The people who insisted over and over that they were innocent were the ones who ended up walking to the gallows. Sit with that for a moment, because it is truly one of the darkest mechanics hiding inside this entire story. A courtroom that only ever rewarded people for lying, and only ever punished them for telling the truth. It is not entirely unlike a modern plea bargain if you think about it, where admitting guilt, whether or not it is real, is so often the safer legal choice than insisting on innocence and trusting a jury to see the truth. Salem simply took that same grim logic and pushed it about as far as it can possibly go. If you had been standing in Sarah Good's place that morning knowing what we now know, what would you have done? Would you have confessed to something you did not do just to survive? Or would you have told the truth and taken your chances? I do not think there is an easy answer to that. I am honestly not sure I know what I would choose, and I hope none of you ever have to find out. By the 7th of March, all three women, Good, Osborne and Tituba, were sent away to jail in Boston, chained to wait for a trial that did not yet formally exist, in a colony that, as we talked about a little earlier, barely had a working government to hold one. Sarah Osborne, sick before she was ever arrested, would not survive long enough to see her own trial. Sarah Good's case was far from finished, and Tituba, having given the village exactly what it wanted to hear, would spend more than a year sitting in that same jail, mostly forgotten, while the crisis she'd helped set in motion grew into something almost nobody could have imagined that first morning. Because here is what should truly unsettle you. It did not stop with three convenient, unpopular outsiders. Within a few weeks, a warrant was issued for one more member of the Good family, Sarah's own daughter, a small girl named Dorothy, only 4 years old, who had become the youngest person ever jailed for witchcraft in the history of Salem. She was questioned by grown men until, cold, hungry, and terrified, she told them what they seemed to want to hear. She was carried off to jail anyway, and held there for months in chains sized down to fit a small child's wrists in a stone building, never meant to hold anyone that young. 4 years old. I want you to sit with that for a moment before we move forward, because I think it says something important about exactly how far this was about to travel. Whatever Salem Village believed it was protecting itself from that winter, it clearly was not going to stop at logic or mercy or the age of the person standing accused. What began as 3 names that almost everyone in the village already had a reason to distrust was not going to stay contained to the easy targets for very much longer. Once it stopped being about the poor, the sick and the enslaved, and started reaching into respected church-going households across Salem Village, families who owned land, sat in the front pews, and had never once been whispered about before people were going to have to ask themselves a much harder question. Who exactly got to decide which of their neighbours was named next and why? As it turns out, one particular family's name kept showing up on that kind of paperwork far more often than any other in the entire village. We already saw it once right there on the very first warrant, 4 names deep. And the further you dig into who accused whom that spring, the more that same name keeps surfacing again and again in ways that have very little to do with the devil, and a great deal more to do with something far more familiar: land, money. And a grudge that had been quietly simmering in Salem Village for years before Betty Paris ever crawled under a table. Here is a question worth asking before we go any further tonight. When a community turns on itself this violently, is it ever really about the thing everyone claims it is about, or is the stated reason almost always sitting on top of something older, pettier, and far more human? Because the deeper you look into Salem Village, the more that second option starts to look like the honest answer, and once you see it, you cannot really unsee it in the rest of this story. Let's talk about the Putnams and about a family named the Porters, and about a grudge that had been quietly rotting under the surface of this community for nearly 3 decades before anyone ever screamed the word witch. Salem Village, you might remember, was not actually its own town. It was a farming settlement on the outer edge of Salem proper, near enough to be taxed and governed by Salem town, far enough away that most villagers rarely benefited from any of it. It is a bit like living in a suburb that pays full city taxes but never sees the plough come through after a storm. For decades before 1692, the farmers out on that edge had been asking Salem town for more control over their own affairs, a church of their own, a minister of their own choosing, some basic say over the decisions being made about their land and their money by men who lived comfortably down near the harbour and rarely had to walk the same muddy roads the villagers did every single day. That request, reasonable as it sounds, took decades to win and turned out to be the seed of an enormous amount of trouble once it finally arrived. Salem Village finally got permission to build its own small parish, its own meeting house, its own minister, separate from the main congregation in town. Which sounds like a solution. In practice, it created a brand new problem, because now the village had to agree on who that minister should actually be, and how much they were willing to pay him. They did not agree, not even a little. Between the founding of that parish and the winter, everything fell apart. Salem Village burned through 3 ministers before Samuel Paris ever arrived. The first, a man named James Bailey, left after years of bitter arguments over his pay worn down, until he simply gave up and moved on. The second was a young minister named George Burroughs. I want you to remember that name because we've already met him once before in this story from a very different direction. Burroughs is the same minister who once employed a traumatized young refugee from the Maine frontier named Mercy Lewis. What I did not tell you earlier is what happened to Burroughs before any of that, back when he was still Salem Village's own reverend. He came to the village, took the job, and within a few years found himself locked in a bitter dispute with the very people who had hired him over money they had promised him, and then simply refused to pay. Some accounts even suggest he was arrested for debt on his way out of town following his own wife's funeral. No less a detail that still manages to feel cruel 3 centuries later. He left Salem Village angry, unpaid, and as it would turn out, quietly remembered by exactly the wrong family. A third minister, Deodat Lawson, lasted only a few years and departed under his own cloud of disagreement, this time over the terms of his ordination. And then finally in came Samuel Paris, a former merchant with no formal ministry training, who negotiated an unusually hard financial bargain for himself before he would even agree to take the pulpit, apparently having learned something useful from watching 3 predecessors get quietly starved out. You might be sensing a pattern here. I certainly do. 4 ministers, 1 small farming village, and an apparently endless supply of arguments over salary firewood, and who exactly held the authority to hire or dismiss a man of God. It is almost funny if it were not for what came next. Try running a workplace where every single employee before you got quietly starved out over a pay dispute, and then walking in on day one wondering why the atmosphere in the room feels so tense. And Paris himself was not exactly walking into that role with an easy mind. He had spent years before the ministry trying to make it as a merchant first in Barbados and later in Boston, and by most accounts that career never quite worked out the way he had hoped. Salem Village was in a lot of ways his second chance, his last real shot at some kind of stability and respect. That is not an excuse for anything that followed, but it might help explain why a man in his position newly arrived, financially anxious, and caught directly between two feuding factions who both expected his loyalty might have been so quick to see the devil's hand at work the moment his own household started to unravel. So who exactly was doing all this fighting? Two extended families sat at the centre of practically every disagreement in Salem Village, and their names were Putnam and Porter. It helps to understand just how small and informal Salem Village's own government actually was. There was a yearly meeting and a small elected committee nowhere near the full authority of an actual incorporated town, which meant that when a genuine dispute broke out over land, over a minister's salary, over practically anything, there was no real neutral system in place to settle it fairly. Neighbours were left to work these things out among themselves informally for years at a stretch, which is a wonderful way to keep old grudges alive far longer than they ever should have survived. The Putnams were an old, sprawling family deeply rooted in the interior farmland of the village, the kind of land that was already running short by the 1700s, for a growing third generation of sons who all expected their own share of it one day. Land does not stretch to fit every grandchild, no matter how much a family might wish it did, and the Putnams were feeling that squeeze more sharply than almost anyone else in the village. They were fiercely loyal to the idea of an independent Salem Village, fiercely loyal to strict traditional Puritan worship, and fiercely loyal to Samuel Paris, almost from the moment he arrived. The Porters were something else entirely, wealthier, better connected, sitting on land closer to Salem town with real ties to shipping trade and the wider Atlantic economy that was slowly transforming the region around them. Where a Putnam farmer might spend his whole life worrying about the next harvest, a Porter was more likely to be worrying about the price of goods coming off a ship in Boston Harbor. The Porters had far less patience for village independence, and even less patience for Paris himself, whose sermons apparently grew sharper and more accusatory toward wealth and worldliness with each passing month. In the 1970s, two historians named Paul Boyer and Stephen Nissenbaum went looking through old church records and stumbled onto something that by their own account felt like a genuine discovery. Buried in the manuscript records of the local church, they found two petitions from several years after the trials, one supporting Paris, one opposing him, each covered in dozens of signatures. Separately, they tracked down a set of old real estate maps from the early 1900s showing exactly where every single family's land sat inside the village boundaries. Then came the part I love picturing. The two of them spread photocopies of those maps out across the floor of an office, piecing together a full picture of the village for what might have been the first time in centuries, and matched every single name on those petitions to the plot of land that family actually owned. When they stepped back and looked at the whole thing laid out together, a pattern practically leapt off the floor at them. The people who lived farther from Salem town, deeper in the village's poorer farmland, tended to support Paris. The people who lived nearer to town, wealthier and better connected, tended to oppose him. Now overlay that same map onto the actual witchcraft accusations of 1692, and the pattern gets even more uncomfortable. A striking number of the accusers came from Putnam households, or families closely allied with them. A striking number of the accused had some connection, direct or indirect, to the Porter side of the village, or to Salem town's more prosperous, commercially minded world. Here is one number that truly stopped me when I first read it. Historians counting through the surviving court documents have found that 8 separate members of the extended Putnam family were personally involved in prosecuting somewhere around 46 of the accused. Not 2 or 3 relatives caught up in the panic. 8, pursuing charges against dozens of their neighbours' cousins, and in more than one case people they had quarrelled with over fence lines and unpaid debts, years before any of this began. Let that sit with you for a moment. Ask yourself honestly if 8 members of one single family in your own town were suddenly filing complaint after complaint against dozens of their neighbours, would your first thought be witchcraft? Or would you start wondering what that family actually wanted? One of the clearest examples sits right inside that pattern. An elderly, well-respected church member named Rebecca Nurse, 71 years old that spring, a grandmother with family ties running toward the Porter side of the village, would eventually be accused despite decades of an unblemished reputation and a lifetime of visible piety. On paper, she was about as far from a likely witch as anyone in the entire village. We're going to spend real time with Rebecca Nurse later on, because her story deserves far more than a passing mention here. For right now, just notice how neatly her family connections happen to line up with exactly the side of the map Boyer and Nissenbaum's petitions predicted decades before anyone thought to draw that map in the first place. And there is one detail inside this feud that I find almost unbearably human more than almost anything else we've talked about so far. Thomas Putnam, one of the loudest and most active accusers in the entire crisis, had a much younger half-brother named Joseph. Their father had left nearly his whole estate to Joseph alone, cutting his older sons out almost entirely, for reasons the records do not fully explain. Thomas and his full brothers never forgave their father for it, and they certainly never forgave Joseph. And to make matters even more pointed, Joseph grew up, and rather than mending that wound, he married into the Porter family, aligning himself openly with the very faction his own half-brothers despised most in the entire village. Joseph Putnam spent 1692 as one of the few outspoken opponents of Samuel Parris, inside a family that was otherwise driving the entire crisis forward. Think about what a family gathering must have felt like that year, assuming they still held any. This was not simply Putnam against Porter Town, against village rich, against poor playing out at a safe distance. In at least one household, it was brother against brother over an inheritance that had already been decided years earlier, now resurfacing dressed up as something far more dangerous than a property dispute. I think it is worth being honest with you here the way I try to be about everything in this story. This theory, as compelling as it is not the whole picture, and serious historians have pushed back on parts of it since it was first published. Later researchers went back through the same court records and found accusers who defended some of the accused relationships that did not sit neatly on either side of the map patterns that dissolved the closer anyone looked. Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. The very first 3 people accused do not fit this pattern at all. They were not wealthy Porter allies threatening anybody's land claim. They were poor, sick, and enslaved, exactly the kind of people a land dispute theory has almost nothing useful to say about. And more than a few wealthy people connected to the Putnams, including Joseph Putnam himself, were never accused of anything, despite standing right there in plain sight the entire time, openly defying the very family driving the prosecutions. So which explanation is the real one? The war trauma bleeding into visions of dark figures in the woods, the decades of resentment between 2 feuding families, the poverty and isolation that made outsiders like Sarah Good impossible to defend. Honestly, I do not think you have to pick only one. and I would be a little suspicious of anyone who tells you they have found the single tidy answer to something this messy. Here is a question worth carrying with you into the rest of tonight's story. Think of the last serious falling out you witnessed inside your own extended family over money, over property, over who felt slighted at whose wedding. Now imagine that same grudge left to simmer for 20 or 30 years suddenly handed a courtroom, a terrified public, and a legal system willing to take an accusation completely at its word. How far do you think it might have travelled? Salem village in the winter of 1692 was not suffering from a single wound. It was suffering from several at once, each one making the others a little more dangerous, the same way we talked about a little earlier tonight. A traumatized population, a village legally divided against itself, and now on top of both of those a family feud sharp enough to turn brothers into strangers. Layer enough old grievances on top of each other, and eventually people stop being able to tell the difference between a neighbour they resent and a neighbour who has actually made a pact with the devil. That confusion, I think, might be the most quietly terrifying part of this entire story. But land and family grudges alone do not explain everything either. A land dispute cannot put a rope around someone's neck. Only a court can do that, and only if the entire community first agrees on what a witch actually is, what she is supposedly capable of, and how you prove beyond doubt that your neighbour has become one. That is the piece of this story almost nobody actually understands correctly, and it is exactly where we need to go next. Shut your eyes for a second and picture a witch. Go ahead, actually do it, I will wait. Pointed black hat, a broomstick leaning against the wall, maybe a cat curled up somewhere nearby, green skin, a wart on the nose, possibly a cackle, you can somehow already hear in your head. Almost everyone watching this pulled up roughly the same image without even trying, and most of you were probably picturing nearly identical outfits, as if witches all shopped at the exact same store. Now here is the strange part. Not one single piece of that picture existed in the mind of anyone living in Salem Village in 1692. Not the hat, not the broomstick, not the cat, not the cackle, none of it. So if that is not what a witch looked like to the people accusing their own neighbours, what did they actually believe they were looking at? That question turns out to matter more than almost anything else in this entire story, because you cannot understand how an ordinary farming village convinced itself to hang 19 of its own people without first understanding what exactly they believed a witch actually was. To a Puritan mind, a witch was not a creature with strange powers of her own. She was not born different or cursed or magical in any inherited sense. A witch in their theology was simply a person, usually a woman who had entered into a formal agreement with the devil. A covenant in the same exact language they used to describe their own relationship with God. Sit with that for a second, because I think it is one of the most quietly revealing details in this whole case. These were people who believed their entire community existed because of a sacred covenant, a promise exchanged with God in return for protection and purpose. Every sermon, every fast day, every hardship endured that winter was understood through that single lens. Witchcraft to them was that same idea flipped upside down and turned inside out. A person who had made a private secret covenant with the enemy, instead trading loyalty and service for small personal favours in this world rather than the next. Not a monster, not something inhuman, just an ordinary neighbour who had in their eyes chosen the wrong master, which meant in practice that literally anyone could be one. Your quiet neighbour, your grandmother, the woman 2 pews over who never quite smiled back at you. There was no visible marker on the outside of a person that told you at a glance who had made that deal and who had not. And that uncertainty, I would argue, is exactly what made this kind of fear so corrosive. If a witch could look like absolutely anyone, then absolutely anyone eventually did. So how then did a court actually convict someone of a crime you could not see, could not measure, and could not prove with anything resembling a weapon, a wound, or a witness who saw an actual crime take place? That question alone should tell you everything you need to know about how shaky the entire legal foundation of this crisis really was right from the very first day, mostly through something called spectral evidence. And once you understand how it worked, a great deal of this story suddenly makes a lot more sense. Spectral evidence meant testimony about a person's spectre, their spirit or apparition appearing separately from their physical body to torment someone. An afflicted girl could stand in open court and swear that the actual visible woman standing accused in front of her was at that very moment sitting quietly on a bench, hands folded, saying nothing at all. And that same girl could also swear in the same breath that the exact same woman's spirit was simultaneously pinching her, choking her, or holding a book out for her to sign somewhere entirely invisible to everyone else in the room. Picture the scene. A courtroom gone completely silent except for one girl's ragged breathing pointing at empty air beside a woman who has not moved an inch, while an entire room of grown adults leans forward, straining to see something that was never actually going to be visible to any of them. Here is a question worth sitting with. How exactly does a person defend themselves against an accusation like that? If your own body being visibly present somewhere else does not count as an alibi, what possibly could? Salem's magistrates did not invent this idea out of nowhere either, which I think is worth knowing. Decades earlier in England, a well-respected judge named Sir Matthew Hale had allowed nearly identical spectral testimony in a witchcraft trial that ended in 2 executions. Salem's own magistrates leaned directly on that earlier English case as legal precedent, treating a decision made an ocean away years before either of them was even born as sufficient justification to do exactly the same thing here. It is a strange kind of comfort borrowing legitimacy from a mistake someone else already made once. Not everyone in Massachusetts was comfortable with any of this even at the time, and I think that detail deserves far more attention than it usually gets. A minister named Increase Mather, one of the most respected religious figures in the entire colony, and father to another minister whose name will come up again before this story is finished, eventually wrote an entire essay arguing that it would be far better for 10 guilty witches to escape justice than for a single innocent person to be wrongly put to death. He specifically singled out spectral evidence as dangerously unreliable, since by definition nobody besides the supposed victim could ever confirm or deny what they claimed to be seeing. It is worth noting that this essay did not appear at the very start of the crisis, when it might have stopped the worst of it before it began. It arrived only after a great deal of damage had already been done, which tells you something about how much easier it is to question a system once you're no longer swept up inside its momentum. We're going to watch exactly how that argument finally starts winning a little further along in this story. For now, just remember that even inside Salem's own religious establishment, there were people quietly uneasy with the entire process while it was still happening. Spectral evidence was not the only method the court leaned on, though. When testimony alone was not considered convincing enough, magistrates turned to the body itself in a process that strips away almost every romantic notion you might still be holding on to about this story. On the 2nd of June 1692, a committee of 9 women was assembled to physically examine 5 of the accused, searching for what was called a witch's mark, sometimes referred to as a witch's teat. The theory went that anyone who had made a pact with the devil, fed spirits, familiar small demonic helpers from an extra mark somewhere on their own body, hidden from ordinary view. The examination itself was invasive and humiliating by any standard, stripping women of every social protection their age or reputation might otherwise have granted them. The committee reported finding exactly that kind of mark on 3 of the 5 women they examined that day. 6 hours later, out of what I can only assume was some lingering uncertainty, they examined the same 3 women again. This time, 2 of those same marks had apparently vanished entirely, and the third was reconsidered as nothing more than a patch of dry skin. I want you to think about that for a moment. The same body, the same mark examined twice in a single afternoon, producing 2 completely different conclusions, and both of those conclusions were treated as valid evidence in a capital case. If that sounds less like careful forensic science and more like people seeing exactly what they had already decided to look for, you are, I think, reading it correctly. Moleskin tag an old scar from childhood, a birthmark every single one of us might be carrying somewhere right now. In that room on that particular afternoon, any of it could have been enough. A few months later, in August, a different pair of accused men went through the same ordeal. One of them, an older farmer, was found to have 3 separate marks, one inside his mouth, one on his shoulder, one near his hip. Examiners drove pins directly into each mark to see whether he reacted with pain. He did not so much as flinch, which today might reasonably be read as remarkable composure under an unimaginably cruel test, perhaps simple shock, perhaps a body that had simply gone numb from fear. At the time, it was read instead as further proof that something unnatural was happening inside his body. Then there was the touch test, which might be the simplest and in some ways the most quietly devastating of everything the court relied on. If an afflicted girl was in the middle of a violent fit and the accused witch was brought near enough to physically touch her, the theory held that whatever invisible evil had been flowing outward from that witch would flow back into her the instant contact was made, and the girl's fit would immediately stop. And it did stop. Again and again, court records describe exactly that happening. A trembling, screaming girl calmed almost instantly the moment the accused woman's hand met her own. I do not think you need any actual witchcraft to explain that particular pattern, and I suspect a fair number of you watching already have a theory of your own. A room full of people staring at you, holding their breath, waiting for a very specific reaction, is more than enough pressure to produce that exact reaction, whether or not anyone involved is being deliberately dishonest about it. Expectation is an extraordinarily powerful thing, especially inside a group of frightened people who all desperately want the same outcome to happen. Ask any performer who has ever felt an entire room lean forward at once, waiting for something specific to happen. The room itself starts pulling the outcome toward it, almost without anyone consciously deciding to help it along. One more test deserves mentioning because it might be the cruelest in its simplicity. The accused could be asked to recite the Lord's Prayer from memory perfectly without a single mistake. The belief was that a true witch, having rejected God, would be physically or spiritually unable to complete it cleanly. Try reciting anything from memory word for word with no room for error, while a room full of your neighbours watches for you to slip silently, hoping that you will. Under that kind of pressure, almost anyone stumbles eventually, even people who have said those same words every single week of their entire lives without a single hitch. And in Salem, a stumble was not treated as ordinary human nervousness. It was treated as a confession spoken by accident. Here is a question I would truly like you to sit with tonight. If the standard for innocence is a flawless performance under public terror, is anyone actually capable of passing that test? Or is it built, whether anyone intended it that way or not, to eventually catch everyone guilty or not, sooner or later? Think for a moment about the last time you had to speak in front of a group of people who were clearly judging you. A job interview maybe, or a wedding toast, or simply answering a question in a meeting while everyone stared at you waiting for your response. Your mind went blank for half a second, or your voice cracked, or you completely lost your train of thought even though you knew the material perfectly well beforehand. Nobody accused you of consorting with the devil for it. But in Salem Village, that exact same very human moment could cost you your life. So if none of this looked anything like the witch most of us pictured a few minutes ago, where on earth did that image actually come from? The pointed hat, the broomstick, the cat? Honestly, the answer is far messier than most retellings admit, and historians still actively argue about the exact origin without much agreement. Some trace the tall black hat to older prejudices against religious outsiders' headwear, associated with groups already viewed with suspicion by the wider culture. Others point to plain, ordinary fashion of the era, tall felt hats worn by countless respectable women, later twisted into something sinister by illustrators working generations after the fact who needed a quick visual shorthand audiences would instantly recognize. The broomstick almost certainly began as nothing more than an ordinary household tool, later folded into folklore about flight through channels no single historian can fully agree on. Even the black cat carries centuries of baggage that has nothing to do with New England at all, tracing back through old European superstition long before Salem existed. What we do know for certain is this: none of it appears anywhere in the actual court records of Salem. Not once. The accused were not identified by strange clothing, or unusual pets, or peculiar objects found in their homes. They were identified because a frightened girl claimed to see their spirit, or because a committee of neighbours thought a mole looked slightly unusual, or because their hand happened to calm a fit at exactly the wrong moment, which might be the most unsettling truth in this entire chapter of the story. The witches of Salem did not look different from anyone else at all. They looked exactly like every other tired, ordinary person living through a brutal New England winter. Your baker, your midwife, the old woman who minds her own business and keeps mostly to herself. That more than any hat or broomstick ever could is precisely what made this kind of fear so impossible to escape once it started, because there was never anything concrete to actually watch out for. Because if a witch could look like anyone, it turned out the courts were about to prove that a witch could also apparently be executed like anyone. Except, as it happens, almost nobody today actually knows how that part of the story really happened either. Most people watching this right now, if I asked you to picture it, are picturing exactly the wrong ending, and it is time we finally fix that together right now. All right, here is the moment I promised you. Let's actually fix that picture in your head once and for all, because I think you deserve the real version of this story, not the one that gets repeated every October without anyone bothering to check it. Not one single person convicted of witchcraft in Salem was ever burned at a stake. Not one. In the entire history of witchcraft prosecutions across every English colony in North America, nobody was ever burned for it. Not in Salem, not in Connecticut, not anywhere. And yet ask almost anyone on the street how the Salem witches died, and I would bet good money the word burned comes out of their mouth before hanged ever does. I know that probably contradicts an image you've been carrying around since you were a child, something absorbed from movies, from Halloween decorations, from 100 half-remembered retellings that never bothered to check their own sources. So let's talk about where that mistake actually comes from, because the real answer says something fascinating about how easily history gets flattened into a single simplified image and passed down that way for generations. Burning at the stake was a real practice and a horrifying one, but it belonged almost entirely to continental Europe, not to England, and certainly not to English colonies like Massachusetts. Under the legal system Massachusetts inherited directly from England, witchcraft was classified as a felony, a civil crime against the state, and the standard punishment for a felony in English law was hanging. Burning in English law was reserved for an entirely different category of offence, things like heresy against the church, or a very specific and rather chilling legal category called petty treason, which covered crimes like a servant killing a master or a wife killing a husband, treated as a smaller echo of treason against the crown itself. Witchcraft simply never fell into that particular bucket under English law, no matter how serious the accusation sounded to the people making it. Continental Europe operated under different legal traditions entirely, often prosecuting witchcraft as a form of heresy under systems more directly tied to church courts, which is part of why burning became so tightly associated with witch trials there, and part of why the association stuck so firmly in the popular imagination. So the confusion is not really anyone's fault if you think about it honestly. Europe truly did burn accused witches in staggering numbers for centuries. Historians estimate somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 people were executed for witchcraft across Europe between the medieval period and the 18th century, and burning was common in a great many of those cases. Salem inherited the fear and the theology and the courtroom procedures we talked about earlier, but it did not inherit that particular method because it was operating under an entirely different legal tradition, 3,000 miles away, shaped by an entirely different set of courts. Here is a question worth turning over for a moment. Salem executed 19 people through legal hangings and lost one more to torture. Compare that to a European death toll in the tens of thousands spread across centuries and dozens of separate countries. Why do you think Salem, a comparatively small tragedy by raw numbers, ended up becoming the version of this story the entire world remembers, while far larger witch panics across the ocean mostly faded into academic footnotes that most people have simply never heard of? I have my own theory, and it has almost nothing to do with the scale of the horror itself and everything to do with how well documented, how uniquely American, and how endlessly retold this particular story turned out to be. Salem left behind nearly 1,000 pages of original court documents, an almost unheard of paper trail for an event this old. It happened in a young country still actively constructing its own founding mythology, hungry for dramatic stories about its own past. And it eventually found itself a permanent home inside American literature and American classrooms, retold in generation after generation of plays, films, and textbooks. Sometimes the event that gets remembered most vividly is not the worst one that ever happened. It is simply the one somebody kept telling loudly and often enough until the rest of the world forgot to ask whether the details were actually correct. So if it was not burning, what did it actually look like? The condemned were taken by cart from the jail to a hill on the edge of town, forced to climb a ladder propped against a sturdy tree limb, and had a rope placed around their neck. There was no trapdoor, no mechanical drop, none of the machinery you might picture from later centuries of formal gallows design. The ladder was simply pulled away, or the cart driven forward out from under them, and the body dropped only a short distance before the rope caught. Without the length of fall needed to break the neck cleanly, death came slowly by strangulation, a process that could take several agonizing minutes, rather than the sudden, almost merciful end that a proper long drop gallows would later provide decades after these particular deaths. I am not telling you this to shock you. I am telling you because I think the actual physical reality of what happened to these 19 people deserves to be remembered accurately, rather than replaced with a cleaner, more dramatic image borrowed from a completely different country's history and quietly softened over centuries of retelling. And here is a detail that really surprised me the first time I came across it, one that turns this into something closer to a detective story than a simple historical footnote. For nearly 300 years, almost everyone, including most professional historians, believed the executions had taken place at the summit of a hill, still known today as Gallows Hill. Tour guides pointed to it. Plaques referenced it. An entire local tourism industry quietly built itself around a location that it turns out was very likely never used for a single hanging in its entire history. A historian named Sidney Purley first raised doubts about that location back in the 1920s, arguing instead for a smaller, lower outcropping nearby called Proctor's Ledge. He based his theory on old interviews with elderly residents whose families had lived in Salem for generations, and on a careful reading of exactly what could and could not be seen from certain nearby houses. It was clever, careful work. But without harder proof, his theory mostly sat forgotten, for the better part of a century filed away in old historical journals nobody outside a small circle of specialists ever read. Then starting around 2010, a small team came together to actually test it properly. A historian, a religious studies professor, a geologist, an author who had spent years transcribing the original trial documents, and a specialist in digital mapping software. They spent years combing through old court records, and buried inside nearly 1,000 pages of surviving testimony, they found something remarkable. A woman named Rebecca Eames, questioned about witnessing an execution during her own preliminary examination, had mentioned watching it happen from a specific house, a house she described only as sitting below the hill. Researchers eventually pinned down its exact location, using old property records, a small clue that most readers before them had simply skimmed past without a second thought. Once they had that single house identified, they used modern mapping software, the kind of tool Sidney Purley could never have dreamed of having access to in his own lifetime, to calculate exactly what could and could not have been visible from its windows in 1692. The actual summit of Gallows Hill, it turned out, was completely blocked from view at that spot, hidden behind a ridge of higher ground. But a lower, closer ledge was clearly visible from those same windows. Proctor's Ledge. Exactly where Sidney Purley had guessed nearly a full century earlier, with nothing but instinct old interviews and careful reasoning to go on. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed there was nowhere on that ledge deep enough to properly bury a body, which lined up perfectly with old family stories, describing relatives sneaking out under cover of darkness to secretly retrieve their loved ones from a shallow crevice at the base of the rock, since the condemned were denied any proper burial at all, their remains treated as unfit for consecrated ground. In January of 2016, after roughly 6 years of painstaking work, the team finally announced what they had confirmed. The wrong hill had been mourned, visited, and quietly memorialized for the better part of 3 centuries, while the actual site sat forgotten, wooded and completely unmarked in someone's ordinary backyard, practically within view of a modern drugstore. A proper memorial finally opened at the correct location in the summer of 2017, on the exact anniversary of the very first hangings that took place there. It took Salem 325 years to grieve correctly at the right address. I find something quietly moving about that, honestly. An entire community spent centuries visiting the wrong grave, and it took a woman's forgotten testimony about a house she watched from, and a handful of researchers willing to take her words seriously to finally set it right. Now, I promised you Giles Corey earlier in this story, and I have been holding him back on purpose because his death did not happen anywhere near that ledge, and it did not involve a rope at all. Before we get to what happened to him, ask yourself something honestly. If you had to guess right now how a man that age died during this crisis, what would you have guessed? Old age in a cold cell, maybe? A hanging like everyone else. I doubt pressed to death under stone was anywhere near your first answer, and that alone should tell you something about how incomplete the popular version of this story really is. Corey was an elderly farmer, somewhere around 80 years old, with a reputation in the village for being stubborn and quarrelsome long before any of this began. He was accused of witchcraft alongside his own wife Martha, a devout church member who had ironically enough been among the few villagers openly skeptical about the whole crisis before accusations turned on her as well. When Corey's case reached trial, he refused to enter a plea of either guilty or not guilty. Under the legal tradition Massachusetts had inherited from England, a person who refused to plead simply could not be tried at all, which created an old and rather brutal legal workaround. The court could order a punishment designed specifically to force a plea out of a silent defendant, a process with a French legal name meaning roughly strong and hard punishment. Corey almost certainly understood exactly what he was choosing and why. Under the law at that time, anyone convicted of a felony forfeited their entire estate to the colony, leaving nothing behind for their children. But a defendant who died without ever entering a plea technically died unconvicted. His land, his farm, everything he owned would pass directly to his family instead of into the government's hands. Weeks before his trial, Corey had already quietly signed his property over to his sons-in-law, just to be certain nothing could be taken from them later, no matter what happened to him personally. So when the court pressed him to answer, he said nothing. He was stripped, laid on the ground in an open field beside the jail, and a wooden board was placed across his chest. Stones were added one by one over the course of 2 full days. Witnesses later described him as remaining almost entirely silent throughout, offering no confession, no plea, nothing at all, except, according to several accounts, a single request spoken more than once as the weight increased. More weight. According to one witness that day, a man named Robert Califf, when it was finally over, the sheriff was reduced to physically forcing the old man's tongue back into his mouth with the tip of his own cane. 3 days later, Corey's wife Martha was hanged, one of 8 people executed together on a single brutal day. Giles Corey remains the only person in the entire history of the American colonies ever put to death by that particular method. And in a final bitter footnote that somehow feels exactly right for this whole story, the very sheriff who carried out his pressing later tried to extort money from Corey's grieving daughter, falsely claiming he still had the authority to seize her father's estate after all, despite the entire point of Corey's suffering having been to prevent exactly that. She paid him out of fear rather than risk losing everything a second time. Here is a question worth sitting with before we move forward tonight. An 80-year-old man chose to endure 2 days of being slowly crushed under stone in complete silence, rather than give a court he no longer trusted a single word to work with. What does it tell you about a legal system when the most rational, most protective choice available to an innocent man was to let himself be tortured to death instead of ever stepping inside it? By most accounts, Corey's death, more than almost anything else that had happened up to that point, began to visibly shake the town's confidence in what its own court was doing. A public, drawn-out killing carried out in complete view of neighbours who had known this stubborn old farmer their entire lives is a difficult thing to witness, and still tell yourself everything happening around you is righteous. We will come back to exactly how that shift in confidence eventually brought the whole crisis to its knees, but for tonight I want you to sit with something smaller and I think quietly important. Everyone pictures Salem's victims as women. It is such a deeply embedded assumption that most people never even question it, the same way nobody questioned that pointed hat a little earlier tonight. Corey was not a woman. Neither was his own accuser's logic really built around what a man his age, his standing, his stubbornness was supposed to represent in a story most of us have been told almost exclusively through the fear and persecution of women, which means the version of Salem most people carry around in their heads is not just wrong about how these 19 people died or where. It turns out to be wrong about who several of them even were. Let's start putting names to that thought, because I think the details matter far more than the general statement ever could. Roughly 1 out of every 4 people accused of witchcraft in Salem was a man. Not a rounding error. Not a handful of unlucky exceptions. Something closer to a quarter of the entire crisis men standing in that same meeting house, facing the exact same charge, the exact same girls pointing and screaming the exact same rope waiting at the end of it. And somehow over 3 centuries almost none of them made it into the version of this story. Most of us actually grew up hearing the plays, the paintings, the Halloween costumes we already spent time debunking earlier tonight. Ask yourself honestly before we go any further. When you picture the crowd standing in that meeting house waiting to be examined, how many men did you actually imagine standing there? If your answer is none or almost none, you are in extremely good company. So was I the first time I read through these records properly? So let's meet a few of them properly one at a time, the way they actually deserve to be remembered. The very first man formally accused in this entire crisis was a farmer named John Proctor. 60 years old, prosperous, respected, and the owner of a busy tavern along the road leading into Salem town. Proctor did not believe a single word of what was happening in his village, and he said so loudly to anyone who would listen. He thought the afflicted girls were putting on a performance. He said as much in public more than once, and reportedly suggested that a good beating would cure most of their symptoms far faster than any court proceeding. That opinion did not stay private for long, and it did not do him any favours. Proctor's own household included a young servant named Mary Warren, who began showing the exact same fits and torments as the other afflicted girls that winter. Proctor, true to his word, tried to physically discipline the behaviour out of her, and for a short while it seemed to work. Her fits stopped. She even posted a note asking the congregation to give thanks for her recovery. Then Proctor left home on business for a few days, and by the time he returned, Mary Warren's symptoms had returned right along with her, and she had rejoined the circle of accusers. I want you to notice something quietly devastating buried inside that detail. The one person in this entire story who tried hardest to physically force an end to the hysteria through methods that were by any honest modern standard deeply wrong on their own terms, still could not stop it from swallowing his own home. Cruelty did not save him. It simply gave the girl closest to him one more reason to turn against him when he was not there to stop her. Proctor's wife, Elizabeth, was accused first, and when John stood beside her in court defending her innocence, refusing to stay quiet, the way a frightened man in his position might reasonably have chosen to, the accusations turned squarely onto him as well. He became, as far as the surviving records show, the very first man named a witch in the entire Salem crisis, and in a small bitter irony, 7 of his own children were eventually named alongside him at one point or another, though most were never formally tried. From his cell he wrote a letter to a group of ministers in Boston, describing the conditions inside the jail and pleading for a fairer hearing outside Salem's own increasingly poisoned courtroom. He asked plainly for the trials to be moved somewhere the judges had not already spent months absorbing the same rumours he was now being condemned by. Several of those ministers were eventually persuaded, and their doubts about the process would matter a great deal later, once the crisis finally began to unravel. For John Proctor himself, it arrived far too late to matter at all. Elizabeth Proctor was pregnant, and colonial law allowed a condemned woman to delay her execution until after giving birth. That single narrow legal mercy is the only reason she survived the crisis at all. John received no equivalent protection. He was hanged on the 19th of August 1692. Here is a question worth turning over. If defending your own wife in open court could get you killed right alongside her, how many husbands in that village do you think quietly chose silence, instead watching people they loved get dragged away without ever risking a single word in their defence? We will never know how many John Proctors there almost were, because staying silent left no trial record behind at all. A second man deserves just as much of your attention tonight because his story flips the entire premise of this crisis on its head. His name was John Willard, and before he was ever accused of anything, he had actually been one of the men enforcing the arrests. A deputy constable, 35 years old, tasked with physically bringing the accused in to face examination. For a while he did exactly that, riding out to fetch neighbour after neighbour at the court's command, and then, according to the surviving record, he simply stopped. He grew visibly uneasy with what he was being asked to do, reportedly saying plainly enough that people remembered it, that he did not believe the people he was arresting were actually guilty of anything. Think about the position that put him in. A man whose entire job depended on trusting the court's judgment, quietly deciding in the middle of the crisis that the court could no longer be trusted at all, and having nowhere safe to put that doubt except into his own refusal to keep working. Refusing to keep doing his job was in this particular courtroom treated as evidence in itself. If Willard doubted the process this strongly, the reasoning apparently went. Perhaps he had his own reasons to want it, stopped perhaps guilt of his own to hide. He was accused, shortly after tried, convicted and executed on the 22nd of September, one of the very last people put to death before the entire machine finally ground to a halt. The man once ordered to drag the accused into court ended up standing in that same dock himself, condemned by the very system he had lost faith in enforcing. Now let me tell you about the man some in the village called the ringleader of the entire conspiracy, the closest thing this whole crisis had to a central villain. Because his story, more than either of the two you just heard, shows exactly how far a determined court could stretch its own logic when it desperately wanted a particular kind of villain, and how many separate threads of this larger story can end up tangled around a single unlucky man. His name was George Burroughs, and by now his name should sound at least a little familiar. We've already met him twice in this story from very different angles, once as the minister, a traumatized refugee girl once served in Maine, and once as the underpaid preacher chased out of Salem village decades earlier by a bitter fight over money. Now finally it is time to tell you what happened when all of that history came looking for him. Burroughs was living far to the north in Wells, Maine, when officers arrived to arrest him and forcibly bring him back to Salem to face trial. Almost immediately, the accusations against him took on a strange, almost mythic quality that none of the other cases quite matched. Witnesses testified to his extraordinary physical strength, describing him lifting a full barrel simply by hooking a single finger into its opening or hoisting a heavy musket off the ground, using nothing but one outstretched hand. Small in stature but famously powerful, the kind of man whose feats of strength had probably been the subject of admiring half-joking village gossip for years long before anyone thought to call it sinister. In a community that believed the devil granted his followers unnatural gifts, that kind of strength was not admired anymore. It was treated as proof. It got darker from there. Two of Burroughs's earlier wives had died under circumstances that were at the time considered nothing more than the ordinary tragedies of colonial life. Now, suddenly, both women were reimagined as murder victims. Witnesses claimed their spirits had appeared dressed in burial shrouds, describing how their own husband had killed them through witchcraft. Add his reputation for failing to properly baptize some of his own children, and Salem's court had assembled almost entirely out of rumour, grief and old grudges, a portrait of exactly the kind of secret powerful villain the entire crisis desperately needed to justify itself. He was found guilty and sentenced to hang alongside 4 others on the 19th of August, the same day as John Proctor. And what happened next is, in my honest opinion, one of the single most affecting moments in this entire story. Standing on the ladder, moments from execution, Burroughs asked to speak. He proclaimed his innocence, and then calmly, without a single stumble, he recited the Lord's Prayer start to finish perfectly in front of the entire crowd. Remember what we talked about earlier tonight, the belief that a true witch was physically incapable of completing that exact prayer without error. Witnesses describe the crowd being moved to tears. Some accounts claim people in the gathering began calling for the execution to be stopped altogether right there in real time, watching a condemned man do the one thing their entire legal framework insisted he should not have been able to do. A minister named Cotton Mather was present that day watching from horseback, and as the crowd's mood visibly shifted toward mercy, he spoke up, reminding everyone present that the devil himself was known to disguise his servants as angels of light, that a convincing performance proved nothing at all. It was, I think, one of the most quietly chilling sentences spoken during the entire crisis, a piece of theology so flexible it could turn a man's own innocence into further evidence of his guilt. The crowd settled. The execution proceeded. The very next day, a young woman named Margaret Jacobs, who had accused both Burroughs and her own grandfather, in order to save herself, wrote a letter recanting every word of her testimony. It changed nothing for either man. It was already too late. So why did men end up caught in this at all, if the fear itself was so heavily rooted in old ideas about women's sin and the supposed weakness of Eve's daughters? Because in nearly every single case, a man's path into that courtroom ran directly through a woman first. A wife already accused defended a little too loudly, a dead wife whose story could be twisted into murder, a servant girl whose fits happened to be directed at her own employer. Men were rarely the original target of Salem's suspicion. They became collateral caught in the blast radius of an accusation that almost always started somewhere else. Historians studying the full list of the accused have found that nearly a third of them were ministers or the immediate family and relatives of ministers, which tells you something important. It was rarely maleness itself under suspicion. It was proximity, reputation, and old debts, financial and otherwise, finally coming due. Here is where the story gets even stranger if you widen the lens beyond Massachusetts entirely. Across the witch panics of Europe, the picture most of us carry overwhelmingly. Female victims held true in a great many regions. Roughly 3 out of every 4 people executed for witchcraft across the continent were women. But not everywhere. In Iceland, the pattern flips almost completely upside down, with somewhere near 9 out of every 10 accused witches being men. Normandy leaned heavily male as well. So did Estonia. Finland landed almost exactly in the middle, men and women accused in roughly equal numbers. Sit with that for a moment, because I think it says something important about the entire premise of this myth. If witchcraft accusations were purely universally about controlling women, that pattern should look roughly the same everywhere you go. It does not. It shifts sometimes dramatically based on local economics, local religion, local grudges, exactly the same messy human forces we have been tracing through Salem this entire night. None of which erases the very real misogyny sitting underneath so much of what happened in Salem specifically. Women were still the overwhelming majority of the accused here, and Puritan theology absolutely did teach that women as the spiritual daughters of Eve were considered more naturally vulnerable to the devil's persuasion than men. Ministers of the era preached openly about women as the weaker vessel, quoting scripture to support the idea that female nature itself carried a built-in susceptibility to temptation that men in their view simply did not share to the same degree. That belief was real. It was preached from the very pulpit Samuel Parris stood behind every single Sunday, and it mattered enormously in shaping who Salem's suspicion reached for first and fastest. It simply was not on its own the entire story in Salem or anywhere else. Here is a question worth carrying with you as we wrap up this part of the story. If a belief system built almost entirely around suspicion of women could still end up hanging farmers, ministers, and a one-time constable, what does that tell you about how fear actually spreads once it gets loose in a community? Maybe it never really stays inside the box we build for it. Maybe it just eats whatever is standing nearest by. Which brings us to one final myth. I think you are ready for now, maybe the biggest one of all, and one that quietly reshapes almost everything we've talked about tonight. Because if you assume this kind of fear stayed neatly contained inside one small, unlucky village in Massachusetts, a single town somehow uniquely cursed among its neighbors, you're about to find out exactly how far beyond Salem's borders this particular panic actually reached, and just how many other names never made it into the story at all. Let's start with a town that quietly beats Salem at its own worst statistic, because I think it might be the single most surprising fact in this entire story. A farming community a little further inland called Andover ended up with more people formally accused of witchcraft than Salem Village and Salem Town combined. Not a near second. More. And I would guess that most people watching this right now, even people who think they already know this story fairly well, have never once heard that name mentioned. Here is how it actually happened, and it is nothing like the slow, organic dread we watched build across Salem Village earlier tonight. In the middle of that summer, an Andover farmer named Joseph Ballard found himself watching his wife Elizabeth grow sicker by the week, with no doctor able to explain why. She'd been unwell for months, wasting slowly, and nothing the local physicians tried seemed to help even a little. Having heard what was happening one town over, Ballard made a decision that in hindsight looks almost unbelievably reckless. He personally travelled to Salem Village and brought two of the very same afflicted girls back home with him, specifically to examine his wife and identify who exactly was cursing her. Try to picture that trip. A worried husband riding out along dirt roads to fetch two teenage girls from a neighbouring town, hoping their particular talent could save the woman he loved. It probably felt to him like calling in a specialist. It is one of the more human, almost sympathetic decisions buried inside this entire tragedy, and it is also the exact decision that would end up destroying dozens of his own neighbours' lives. Elizabeth Ballard did not recover. She died that same summer. But by then the machinery her husband had invited into Andover was already running entirely on its own. Think about what that original decision actually means. This was not a village slowly discovering its own internal fear the way Salem had. This was a single, frightened husband personally importing the machinery of accusation, inviting it across town lines like a specialist called in for a second opinion. Within days of the girl's visit, several Andover residents has been named. Within a matter of weeks, that number had climbed past 40. Andover's local minister, a young man named Thomas Barnard, threw himself into the crisis with real enthusiasm. On a single day in September, he assembled every accused person from the entire town at once inside the meeting house, alongside the visiting afflicted girls, and organised something historians now call the touch test on an almost industrial scale. One by one, blindfolded, the accused were led forward and made to place a hand on one of the afflicted girls in the middle of a fit. If the girl's screaming stopped, guilt was considered confirmed on the spot in front of the entire assembled town. Picture that scene for a second. Dozens of your own neighbours blindfolded, standing in a line inside your own meeting house, waiting their turn to touch a screaming teenager and find out in front of everyone they had ever known whether they were about to be arrested. Farmers who had shared fences and church pews with these families for decades, forced into a queue like something out of a factory floor, each one hoping their hand would land on skin and change nothing at all. Not everyone in Andover went along with it quietly either. The town's older minister, Reverend Francis Dane, who had served the parish for decades, before his younger colleague Barnard ever arrived, spoke out against the entire process from the very beginning. It did not save his own family. Several of his relatives were accused regardless, including his own daughter, who would later write a letter from her prison cell that historians believe helped push the colony's leadership toward finally ending the crisis altogether. We will come back to exactly how that ending unfolded a little further along in this story. Andover's minister was not acting entirely alone either. He was by most accounts personally mentored by a well-known Boston minister who believed deeply that an invisible spiritual war was sweeping across the entire colony, one town at a time. That mentor's name was Cotton Mather, and this will not be the last time his influence quietly shapes events far beyond Salem's own borders in this story. Here is a question worth sitting with. If a neighbouring town could import this entire crisis in a matter of days, simply by inviting the right two visitors across its border, how contained do you honestly think any of this ever really was? Because Andover was not some isolated exception. Accusations that year eventually reached well over 200 people, scattered across more than 20 different towns: Topsfield, Ipswich, Gloucester, Beverly Marblehead, even as far as Boston itself. Entire extended families in some of these towns were swept up together, parents and children named in the same week, sometimes by the very same visiting accusers who'd already made a name for themselves back in Salem. In Andover alone, whole households disappeared into jail, together mothers and daughters and grandmothers named in the same complaint, a pattern of accusation that spread through bloodlines almost as efficiently as it spread through gossip. One extended family there saw 5 of its members accused within days of one another, including 2 children young enough that a modern reader can barely process the idea of them standing before a magistrate at all. Ask yourself for a moment what that must have felt like from the inside. Not one accusation landing on your household the way it did in Salem Village, but an entire wave of them arriving all at once from a town you barely knew, carried in by 2 visiting strangers who had never met you before that week. There would have been almost nowhere left to run, and almost no way to argue your own good name back into existence, once the accusation had already been spoken out loud in front of the whole congregation. Now let me pull the lens back even further, because this is the part of tonight's story that I suspect will surprise you the most. Salem was not even the first place in the English colonies to put someone to death for witchcraft. Not even near it. 45 years earlier, in a small Connecticut settlement called Windsor, a woman named Alce Young was hanged in the town square of Hartford, becoming, as far as any surviving record shows, the very first person executed for witchcraft anywhere in what would eventually become the United States. Her trial records have not survived, which is in its own quiet way a kind of tragedy layered on top of the original one. We know almost nothing about the actual accusation against her, only that a serious influenza outbreak had recently torn through her town, killing an unusual number of children, and that Alce Young, for reasons lost to history, ended up being blamed for it. Some historians who have combed through what little property and inheritance records survive have wondered whether money played a quiet role here too. Since a woman positioned to inherit land with no son of her own to naturally receive it, occasionally made an inconvenient and so a convenient target, she was not an isolated case either. Over the following 2 decades, Connecticut authorities tried something near 40 separate people for witchcraft, and executed at least 11 of them, most from towns clustered along the Connecticut River. A servant named Mary Johnson confessed after considerable pressure to a compact with the devil, and was hanged the following year. A husband and wife named John and Joan Carrington, prominent enough members of their own community, were executed together not long after. At one particularly brutal stretch during what historians now call the Hartford Witch Panic of the early 1660s, a married couple named Nathaniel and Rebecca Greensmith were both convicted and executed within the same terrible month part of a small cluster of accused people who went to the gallows one after another in a span of only a few weeks. Sit with that comparison for a moment, because I think it truly reshapes how you should think about Salem's place in this larger story. Connecticut's trials killed a smaller total number of people than Salem eventually would, but for a stretch of years they convicted almost everyone who was formally brought before the court. Salem, chaotic and sprawling as it became at least occasionally acquitted, people occasionally released the accused for lack of evidence. Early Connecticut, by comparison, functioned for a period almost like a machine that rarely let anyone walk back out the other side. So why does almost nobody know Alce Young's name while every American schoolchild eventually learns some version of Salem's? Partly honestly, it comes down to paperwork of all things. Connecticut's early court records are thin scattered, and in many cases simply lost to time, fires, floods, and 3 centuries of ordinary neglect. We know Alce Young existed largely because of 2 brief diary entries, one from a governor, one from a town clerk, each barely a single sentence long. Salem, by contrast, left behind an almost obsessively detailed paper trail examination, transcripts, depositions, warrants, petitions, nearly 1,000 surviving pages that historians are still combing through today, some of it only fully transcribed and made public in the last couple of decades. History does not always remember its worst chapters most vividly. It tends to remember its best documented ones, the ones some clerk somewhere happened to think were worth carefully filing away. There is one more piece of this comparison I want to leave you with tonight because I think it closes the loop rather beautifully. In the spring of 2023, more than 3.5 centuries after Alce Young's execution, the state of Connecticut formally voted to exonerate her, along with 11 others convicted alongside her across those early trials. Lawmakers who supported the resolution spoke openly about wanting to finally correct a wrong that had been sitting unaddressed on the books for longer than the country itself had existed. The vote landed almost exactly on the anniversary of her original hanging. It took Connecticut 376 years to finally say her name out loud again and admit officially that it had been wrong. Here is a question worth sitting with before we move on. If it took an entire state legislature 3.5 centuries to formally clear one woman's name, how many other quiet injustices do you think are still sitting out there right now in other towns, other records simply waiting for someone to go looking? And Connecticut is not even the only place this story stretches beyond New England entirely. 14 years after Salem's own court finally shut its doors, a farmer, healer and midwife in coastal Virginia named Grace Sherwood found herself dragged into a courtroom of her own, accused by a neighbor of causing a miscarriage through witchcraft. Virginia's colonial officials notably seemed truly reluctant to convict her, outright delaying, deferring and passing her case back and forth between courts for months. Eventually, with her own reluctant consent, they resorted to an old test Salem itself had never once used. They bound her thumbs to her opposite toes, weighed her down, and threw her into a river on the theory that pure water would reject the guilty and cause them to float while an innocent person would simply sink. Grace Sherwood floated. She spent years in jail afterward, though tellingly Virginia's authorities never actually followed through on formally executing her, and she eventually returned home to spend the rest of her days on her own land. 300 years later, almost to the day, a sitting governor of Virginia stood up and formally cleared her name too at a ceremony held at the very river where she had once been thrown in bound to sink or float for her life. We're going to spend real time later in this story on how Massachusetts eventually tried to make its own version of that same reckoning, and it did not happen quickly there either. For now, I simply want you to sit with the shape of what we have uncovered together tonight. Salem was not an isolated storm that appeared out of a clear sky over one unlucky village. It was the loudest, longest, and most thoroughly documented eruption of a fear that had already been quietly simmering across New England for nearly half a century before Betty Paris ever crawled under a table, and it was a fear that would go on finding new towns, new rivers, and new names to attach itself to for years after Salem's own courtroom finally fell silent. Which raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with as we move forward tonight. If this fear had already proven itself capable of travelling from town to town, decade to decade, colony to colony, riding along dirt roads on the backs of horses and the reputations of a couple of frightened teenage girls, what exactly made Salem different? Why did this particular outbreak out of all of them spiral so far beyond anything Windsor or Hartford or Andover or a quiet Virginia farm ever became? The answer to that question is sitting inside a courtroom we've not actually walked into yet, at least not all the way. We have talked about the fear that built toward it, the families that fed it, the theology that justified it, and even a few of the individual lives it swallowed along the way, one story, one town, one myth at a time. But we have not yet stood together inside the room where all of that finally became official. The room where a handful of ordinary men in powdered wigs, appointed almost by accident, working without any real legal training or precedent to guide them, turned a village's collective panic into signed warrants, sworn verdicts, and a summer that would end 19 lives in a matter of weeks. It is time we finally went there together and stayed for the whole of it. Governor Phipps signed the paperwork on the 27th of May, 1692, and with that single signature, a special court came into existence that had never existed in Massachusetts before, and would never exist again after that terrible year ended. It was called the Court of Oyez and Termina, an old legal phrase meaning roughly to hear and to decide, and Phipps filled its bench with 9 men. I want you to picture those 9 men for a moment, because I think the popular image of grim black-robed legal experts is almost entirely wrong. Not one of them had any formal legal training. They were merchants, landowners, militia officers, men respected for their wealth, and their standing in the community handed enormous unfamiliar power over life and death, with essentially no relevant experience to guide them. The Chief Justice, a man named William Stoughton, had spent most of his career in politics and theology, not law. 2 of the men already familiar to you from earlier examinations, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, simply carried their existing roles straight into this new, far more consequential court, still asking the exact same kinds of leading questions they have been asking for months only now, with the actual power to hang someone attached to their judgment. Think about the sheer speed of it too. This court did not exist in April. By the end of May, it had full legal authority to try a capital case. By June, it had already killed someone. An entire judicial apparatus invented, staffed, and put to lethal use inside little more than 6 weeks. Have you ever watched an institution get built around a crisis in real time rather than in careful preparation for one? It tends to bear the shape of whatever fear built it, far more than the shape of careful, considered justice. Salem's new court was no exception. Here is a question worth asking yourself honestly. If you were suddenly handed the power to decide whether your own neighbours lived or died with no legal training, no precedent to lean on, and an entire terrified community watching your every decision, how confident are you that you would get it right? The court held its first actual trial on the 2nd of June. The woman in the chair that day was named Bridget Bishop, and her story tells you almost everything you need to know about exactly what kind of evidence this court was prepared to accept. Bishop ran a small tavern, wore clothing considered a little too bright and fashionable for a proper Puritan woman, quarrelled loudly and publicly with more than one husband over the years, and had decades earlier already survived one earlier brush with witchcraft accusations that never went anywhere. None of that on its own should have been a legal problem for anyone. In 1692, Salem it made her exactly the kind of person a jury was primed to believe capable of anything. She was, in other words, exactly the sort of woman the village had already quietly decided to distrust years before anyone ever accused her of anything supernatural at all. Witnesses described her spirit crushing the breath out of a sleeping man in his own bed. Workers hired years earlier to take down an old cellar wall on her property came forward describing small cloth dolls they claimed to have found hidden inside it, stuck through with headless pins, an object that to a Puritan jury screamed of dark, deliberate malice, rather than a simple children's toy or forgotten household item left behind by some previous tenant. On the same afternoon as her trial, a group of women physically examined her body alongside two other accused women and reported finding what they described as an unusual growth evidence in their eyes of exactly the kind of witch's mark we talked about earlier tonight. Notice, if you will, how little of that evidence actually describes an observable action. A doll found in a wall years before anyone thought to worry about it. A body examined for a mark that a handful of frightened, untrained women decided on the spot looked suspicious. A reputation for wearing the wrong colour, marrying the wrong number of times, arguing too loudly in public. This was the evidentiary bar the very first trial of the entire crisis managed to clear. Bridget Bishop was found guilty that same day. She was hanged 8 days later on the 10th of June, the very first person executed in the entire Salem crisis. And here is the detail from her case that I think deserves far more attention than it usually gets. Almost immediately afterward, one of the 9 judges on that brand new court, a man named Nathaniel Saltonstall, quietly resigned his position altogether. He left no lengthy public explanation, no dramatic speech. But those near him later reported that he had grown deeply uneasy with exactly how thin the actual evidence against Bishop truly was, uneasy enough that he could not bring himself to keep signing his name to verdicts built on so little. Sit with that for a moment. One of the very first men given real official power inside this crisis took one clear look at how it actually operated and walked away from it entirely within days of watching it claim its first life. He was never punished for that decision. He simply stepped back into private life and largely vanishes from this story from that point forward, a quiet, mostly unremarked upon act of conscience sitting right at the very beginning of everything that followed. I find that quietly striking given everything else we've talked about tonight. A judge could walk away from this machine entirely and face no consequences whatsoever for it. A village constable doing essentially the same thing in a smaller, humbler way ended up standing trial himself. Conscience, it seems, was only ever safe to act on from a certain height. A handful of ministers from across the colony noticed the same warning signs almost immediately. In the middle of June, 12 of them signed a joint letter urging the court to proceed with real caution, to avoid convicting anyone on spectral evidence alone, and to remember that the devil himself was fully capable of appearing in the shape of an entirely innocent person, specifically to cause confusion and destruction. It was in hindsight a remarkably clear warning delivered by respected voices at a moment when it might still have changed something. The court read it, thanked the ministers for their concern, and by every account we've essentially ignored it, continuing on exactly as before. Which brings us to a name some of you have been waiting to hear more about, because I promised her story deserved real time and I meant it. Rebecca Nurse was 71 years old, partially deaf, frail enough that she reportedly needed help simply to be carried into the meeting house for her own examination. She had spent decades as one of the most visibly devout, well-respected church members in the entire village, the kind of woman whose name before that spring nobody would ever have thought to say in the same breath as witchcraft. 39 of her neighbours were brave enough to sign a petition testifying to her good character at real personal risk to themselves. When her trial finally reached the jury on the 30th of June, after hearing all of the spectral testimony against her, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. For one brief moment it looked like the system might actually work the way it was supposed to. Picture the relief in that room. A frail elderly woman surrounded by family who had fought for her, finally allowed to believe the worst might actually be over. Then the afflicted girls in the courtroom erupted into violent fits right there the instant the verdict was read aloud. Chief Justice Stoughton, visibly displeased, stopped the proceedings and asked the jury whether they had properly considered something Nurse had said earlier in the day. During an exchange involving another accused woman, a woman named Deliverance Hobbs Nurse had reportedly remarked that the woman was, in her words, one of us. Stoughton suggested the jury may have overlooked this as a possible confession of shared guilt. The jury, uneasy, now asked Nurse directly what she had meant by it, and because of her partial deafness in a courtroom full of noise and tension, she never heard the question clearly enough to answer. She would later explain in writing that she had simply meant the other woman was a fellow prisoner, nothing more sinister than that. But that explanation came too late to help her, offered only after the moment where it might have mattered had already closed. Her silence was read as confirmation. The jury went back out and returned this time with a verdict of guilty. Rebecca Nurse's own family fought desperately afterward, gathering testimony, petitioning the governor directly, and for a brief window they actually succeeded. Phipps granted her a reprieve. It was reversed within days, reportedly, after several local officials pressed him hard enough to change his mind. On the 3rd of July, before her execution had even taken place, her own church formally voted to excommunicate her, stripped of the very faith community she had served her entire life. On the same afternoon the vote was taken, with her present to hear it read aloud. She was hanged on the 19th. Here is a question worth sitting with. A woman survives an initial acquittal only to be convicted because she could not hear a question clearly enough to defend herself against it. How many other verdicts that summer do you think hinged on something just as small, just as human, just as unrelated to any actual evidence of witchcraft at all? Sarah Good was hanged that very same day alongside Rebecca Nurse and 3 other women on a hillside crowded with spectators who had walked out from town to watch. And unlike Nurse Good, went to her death without a shred of quiet resignation. Standing at the gallows, a minister named Nicholas Noyes pressed her one final time to confess, insisting that a true confession even now might still save her mortal soul. Good, by every surviving account, refused to give him the satisfaction. She told him plainly that she was no more guilty of witchcraft than he himself was, and warned him that if her life was taken over a lie, he would answer for it in blood of his own one day. I am not going to tell you that curse came true in any supernatural sense, because it did not, and I think you know, by now, that is not the kind of story I am interested in telling you. But local memory held on to those words for generations afterward anyway, which tells you something almost as interesting as a real curse would have. Even the people who built this entire crisis on the idea of invisible spiritual justice could not quite let go of the idea that some final reckoning was still owed to a woman like Sarah Good, the same beggar and outcast we met all the way back at the very start of tonight's story, still refusing right up to her very last breath to give her accusers the confession they wanted from her. By September, the machinery reached its cruelest single day. 8 people were hanged together in one morning, the largest mass execution of the entire crisis, a scene so openly brutal that even some of its strongest remaining supporters began quietly admitting in private letters and later testimony that something about the pace and certainty of it all had started to feel wrong. Word of that morning travelled fast through the surrounding towns, and it did not travel the way the court might have hoped. 19 people hanged, 1 pressed beneath stone, several more dead in overcrowded jail cells before they ever saw a verdict at all, and all of it built trial after trial almost entirely on the testimony of a small handful of teenage girls, a handful of overwhelmed jurors doing their best inside a legal system. None of them had been trained to operate, and 9 untrained men who'd been handed more power than any of them likely ever expected to hold in one lifetime. What strikes me most looking back over the actual court calendar from that summer is simply how fast all of it moved. Cases that should reasonably have taken weeks of careful investigation were sometimes heard and decided within a single working day verdict, and sentencing included. A court with essentially no prior experience trying capital cases somehow developed within a matter of months an almost industrial rhythm for convicting people. Ask yourself honestly if a modern court moved that quickly through cases carrying a death sentence. Would you trust a single verdict it produced? I certainly would not, and I do not think you would either. Which brings us honestly to a question a lot of people ask the moment they learn the basic outline of this story. Surely, they say, there has to be a simple, tidy scientific explanation sitting underneath all of this. Some real physical cause. Nobody in 1692 understood something that would let us look back at everything we've talked about tonight and say with real confidence, here is what actually happened chemically, biologically, and none of it was really anyone's fault at all. As it turns out, there is a wildly popular theory that claims to offer exactly that. It sounds clever, it sounds scientific, it has appeared in documentaries, magazine articles, and more than one classroom lecture over the past 50 years, and it has convinced a great many people over the years. It is also almost certainly wrong, and I think after everything we've walked through together tonight, the human families, the courtroom, the judges, the girls, the neighbours, you deserve to know exactly why a simple chemical explanation could never actually account for any of it. Here is the theory, and I want to be fair to it before I take it apart, because on the surface it sounds almost too tidy to resist. Somewhere in a damp storage bin in Salem Village, the theory goes a batch of rye grain quietly grew a small dark fungus. Nobody noticed. Nobody could have noticed, not with the science available to them at the time. That grain got ground into flour, baked into bread, and served at ordinary family tables, and a chemical compound inside the fungus startlingly similar to a substance most of you already know. By another name, quietly worked its way into the bodies of a few particular households. Convulsions, hallucinations. The sensation of being pinched, bitten, crawled on by something invisible. Symptoms indistinguishable on paper from what history books tell us Betty Paris and the other afflicted girls actually experienced. No devil, no malice, no village full of people choosing one accusation at a time to destroy their own neighbours. Just bad grain and bad luck, and an entire tragedy quietly explained away by something growing silently in a barrel nobody thought to check. I understand completely why that story's appealing, and I want you to actually sit with why for a second rather than just brushing past it. It lets everybody off the hook. It turns Salem from a story about human cruelty into a story about crop storage, from a question of moral failure into a question of agriculture. Nobody has to sit with the harder, more uncomfortable question of why real people chose again and again, week after week, to believe the absolute worst about their neighbours. It is clean. It is scientific sounding. It fits neatly into a single paragraph, the kind you could repeat confidently at a dinner party, and sound impressively well informed. And it has been repeated in documentaries, magazine articles, and more than one classroom for nearly 50 years, now passed along by people who mean well, and simply never had a reason to check where it actually came from. It also does not hold up, and I think after everything we have walked through together tonight, you deserve the real story of how that theory rose, and how thoroughly it eventually fell apart. The fungus in question is called ergot, and it is a truly real, truly dangerous organism that can grow on rye under the right damp, cool conditions, the kind of conditions a wet spring followed by a humid summer might easily produce in a New England grain field. Consuming enough of it produces a condition called ergotism, and it actually comes in two distinct forms. One is gangrenous, causing blackened dying tissue in the extremities, as blood flow is choked off, a slow, visibly horrifying condition that was well documented in medieval Europe, where it earned the grim nickname St. Anthony's Fire. The other is convulsive, producing hallucinations, muscle spasms, violent convulsions, and severe digestive distress. One of the active compounds inside ergot is chemically related to the same family of molecules found in lysergic acid, the basis of a certain famous psychedelic drug most of you have at least heard of, even if you have never touched it yourselves. It is a legitimately fascinating piece of chemistry, and I understand completely why a researcher looking for an explanation might land on it. In the spring of 1976, a graduate researcher named Linda Caporal published an article in the respected journal Science, arguing that the weather patterns and rye storage habits of Salem Village lined up neatly with exactly the conditions ergot needed to thrive, and that the timing of the girl's symptoms matched closely enough the timeline you would expect from a household slowly consuming contaminated grain through the winter months. It was a clever piece of detective work, remarkably creative, and it landed at exactly the right cultural moment to catch fire in the public imagination, a moment when audiences were hungry for rational chemical explanations for things previous generations had chalked up to the supernatural. Here is a question worth sitting with for a second. Have you ever noticed how a theory that sounds properly scientific tends to get believed faster and remembered longer than one that simply says people are complicated and cruelty rarely has one single tidy cause? I think that says something important about all of us, not just about the readers of a 1976 science magazine, because almost immediately other researchers went looking at the actual evidence Caporel's theory would require, and it started falling apart astonishingly fast. Two psychologists, Nicholas Sparnos and Jack Gottlieb, published a detailed rebuttal in the very same journal before that same year was even over. Their case against the ergot theory is worth walking through properly, because I think it is a truly satisfying piece of historical detective work in its own right. The kind of quiet, patient fact-checking that rarely gets nearly as much attention as the original flashier claim. Start with the gangrene. If a Salem household had truly been consuming enough toxic ergot to trigger widespread convulsions and hallucinations, you would expect at least some cases of the other physical form of ergotism showing up in the same community: blackened fingers, dying toes, the kind of visible tissue damage that colonial doctors, limited as their knowledge was, would almost certainly have noticed and written down somewhere. Nobody has ever found a single documented case of it anywhere in the Salem records from that entire crisis. Not one. If the fungus was strong enough to make teenage girls scream and convulse in open court, it should have been more than strong enough to leave some physical mark on somebody's hands or feet as well. Then there is the question of who actually got sick. Convulsive ergotism in the documented medical cases historians have studied since shows up overwhelmingly in populations already suffering from vitamin A deficiency, because that deficiency appears to make the human body substantially more vulnerable to the toxin's worst effects. Salem Village sat a short distance from the ocean in a farming and fishing economy, with regular access to fish and dairy, two of the richest natural sources of vitamin A available anywhere in the colonial world. It is frankly an unusually poor candidate for a population already primed for this specific kind of poisoning, closer to the opposite of the conditions under which this disease is actually known to flourish. And then there is the age pattern, which might be the detail that convinces me most of all. Ergotism in real documented outbreaks tends to strike small children, especially hard, their smaller bodies far less able to tolerate the toxin. But when researchers went back through the actual Salem court records looking for young children showing convulsive symptoms during the crisis, they found almost none. One afflicted girl, and heartbreakingly one 8-week-old infant who convulsed and died during that same period, a case sometimes cited as possible evidence. Except infants that young are still nursing, not yet eating solid grain themselves, and nursing infants essentially never develop ergotism, even when their own mothers are seriously poisoned by it. The single most vulnerable potential victim in the entire record turns out to be medically incapable of having the condition at all. There is one more problem with the theory that I think cuts deepest of all, and it has nothing to do with medicine. If a household really had been hallucinating from a toxic fungus, you would expect the resulting visions to be somewhat random, drawn from whatever fears and images happen to be floating through a poisoned mind at any given moment. What we actually see in the Salem records is the opposite of random. The spectres the girls named again and again tracked with remarkable precision onto exactly the people their own families already had reasons to distrust, the very same Putnam and Porter fault lines we spent real time mapping earlier tonight. A chemical hallucination does not know which family owes which other family money. It does not know who inherited land and who did not. Ergot poisoning cannot explain why the accusations move so consistently along lines of existing grudge and rivalry, rather than scattering randomly across the entire village the way a genuine toxic outbreak would. One of the very historians we have leaned on throughout tonight's story, Stephen Nissenbaum, whose work on Salem's internal land disputes we spent real time with earlier, raised what might be the simplest and most devastating objection of all, almost the moment Caporale's article appeared. If contaminated, Rye truly explained what happened in Salem Village that winter. He pointed out you would expect a crisis like this to happen constantly in any other year, any other household, any other farming village across New England that happened to store its grain in similarly damp conditions. Ask yourself the same question, honestly. Damp storage bins and cool New England summers were not exactly a rare combination in colonial farming villages. If bad rye alone could produce something like this, why did it only ever produce something like this once, in this one particular place, at this one particular moment? It did not happen anywhere else, not at anything near this scale. Salem's particular combination of fear, land disputes, war trauma, and family grudges, the very tapestry we have spent this entire evening carefully unpacking together, simply cannot be replaced by a single contaminated grain bin without losing almost everything that actually explains why this specific place, at this specific moment, spiraled so far beyond anywhere else. A historian named Mary Matossian tried to revive a version of the theory again in the early 1980s, arguing the weather conditions really had been unusually favourable for ergot that particular year, and that the symptoms lined up more closely than critics had given credit for. Spanos returned to challenge her directly, calling her defence, in his own words, misleading and largely beside the point. The scientific argument mostly ended there decisively, and has stayed settled ever since among the historians who actually study this event professionally. It is worth noting, honestly, that none of the major historians whose research has quietly guided almost everything we have discussed across this entire story, the war trauma research, the land dispute mapping the court records, the site of the actual hangings, bother including the ergot theory in their serious published work at all anymore. To the people who have spent entire careers inside these court documents, It simply is not considered an open question worth debating anymore. So why does it keep coming back anyway? Why does some version of this theory still show up in documentaries and classrooms and casual conversation nearly 50 years after it was first and thoroughly taken apart by the very same scientific process that produced it in the first place? I think the honest answer is the same one we have circled back to more than once tonight already. A contaminated grain bin requires nothing from anyone. It asks no uncomfortable questions about which families accused which neighbours, or why a court kept convicting people on evidence this thin, or what it actually takes for an entire community to convince itself that murdering its own was righteous. Mould does not choose sides. Mould does not settle old grudges. Mould cannot be held morally responsible for anything at all, which is precisely what makes it such a comfortable place to rest an explanation. Ask yourself something honestly right now before we move any further. When something terrible happens in history or even in your own life, which explanation do you find yourself reaching for first? The one that says nobody could have prevented it, an accident of chemistry, bad luck, forces entirely outside anyone's control, or the one that says people made choices one after another, small and human and preventable, and those choices added up to catastrophe? I suspect most of us reach for the first kind of story instinctively almost every single time because it costs us so much less to believe. There is something almost funny about it too, honestly, in a very dark way. An entire tragedy built on fear, gossip land disputes and old grudges eventually got reduced in the popular imagination to a story about bread going bad in a cupboard. It is the historical equivalent of blaming a house fire on a single loose thread when the truth is somebody left every candle in the building burning at once. And I think deep down a great many people would simply rather believe in bad bread than sit with what actually happened here, which is a great deal harder and a great deal more human to look at, honestly. It is far more comfortable to imagine 19 people died because of a fungus nobody could have detected than to imagine they died because their neighbours chose court date after court date to keep believing the worst about them. Which is exactly what we're going to do next together, whether it is comfortable or not. Because eventually, even inside Salem itself, people started asking themselves some version of the very same question you and I have been circling all night. Not what poisoned us, but what did we actually do to each other with our own two hands, and how exactly does a community even begin to carry that answer once the fear finally starts to break? It did not happen quickly. It did not happen because anyone suddenly discovered a hidden batch of mouldy grain, or because a single dramatic piece of evidence disproved the entire premise of witchcraft overnight. It happened slowly, painfully, through doubt that built quietly among people who had spent months convincing themselves otherwise, and through a handful of individuals brave enough to finally say out loud that something about all of this had gone terribly wrong. That reckoning is where we need to go next, because it turns out that even after the very last rope was cut down, this story was nowhere near finished. The machine that had killed 19 people did not stop because anyone in charge suddenly grew a conscience overnight. It stopped in the end for a reason almost embarrassingly human. By the autumn of that terrible year, the accusations had climbed high enough to reach the governor's own household. Someone somewhere in that endless chain of afflicted girls and frightened witnesses named Governor Phipps's own wife, Lady Mary Phipps, as a witch. Think about that for a second. A crisis built entirely on the premise that anyone could secretly be an agent of the devil had finally predictably pointed itself directly at the one household in the entire colony with the actual power to shut it down. Phipps had spent the summer away from Salem, off leading a military campaign on the very same northern frontier we talked about earlier tonight, largely unaware of exactly how far the machinery back home had spiraled in his absence. He came home to find his own wife's name on an accusation, and by most accounts that was the moment his patience with the entire process finally ran out for good. Funny how quickly a system built entirely on trusting every single accusation starts to look a lot less trustworthy the moment it points a finger at somebody standing right next to you. In October of 1692, Phipps quietly dissolved the Court of Oyer and Termina, the same court we spent real time inside earlier tonight. A new court was assembled in its place in January of the following year, and this time spectral evidence, the dreams, the visions, the invisible pinching and choking we talked about at length, was no longer permitted as grounds for conviction on its own. Here is a detail I think deserves far more attention than it usually gets. Once that single rule changed, nothing else about the process really did. The same magistrates, the same accusers, the same terrified community. And with spectral evidence removed from the table, the new court moved through dozens of remaining cases and convicted almost nobody. Person after person, facing charges built on exactly the same kind of testimony that had already sent 19 people to their deaths, walked free. Sit with that for a moment, because I think it is one of the most quietly devastating facts in this entire story. A single change in what counted as evidence was apparently all it would have taken from the very beginning to save almost every single life that was lost. Not a miracle, not a change of heart, just a rule applied a few months too late. By May of 1693, Phipps had pardoned everyone still awaiting trial or execution. The killing stopped. But stopping the killing and actually reckoning with what had happened turned out to be two entirely different processes, and the second one took a great deal longer than anybody in Salem village could possibly have expected. For years afterward, an uncomfortable silence settled over the whole affair. Most of the men who had sat on that court simply continued with their lives and their careers, as though nothing unusual had happened at all, returning to their farms, their shops, their pews, as if the entire episode could simply be filed away and left there. One of them, Jonathan Corwin, the very magistrate who had questioned Tituba Sarah Good, and dozens of others back at the very start of this story, never once offered a public word of apology or regret for any of it. Not in his diary, not from any pulpit, not to any of the families whose lives his signature had helped destroy. He simply kept living in the same house, in fact, that still stands in Salem today, and is visited by tourists every single year, kept serving on the bench, and carried whatever he actually felt about it quietly to his grave. Contrast that with a very different man sitting on that very same court, on a day of public fasting in January of 1697, ordered by the colony's own general court to atone for the calamities of the previous years. A judge named Samuel Sewell stood in his pew at Boston's South Church, while his own minister read a written statement aloud to the entire congregation on his behalf. In it, Sewell took personal responsibility for his role in the trials, described the guilt and shame he carried, and asked both God and the wider community for forgiveness. He did not sit quietly through the reading either. He stood in full view of everyone present, head bowed for the whole of it, in a church packed with neighbours who would have known exactly what he was confessing to and exactly what it had cost. That same day, 12 of the men who had served as jurors during the trials signed and issued their own joint statement, admitting they had convicted people on evidence they now believed had been insufficient, and asking pardon from the families of those they had wrongly condemned. Sewell's penance did not end that afternoon either. By several accounts, he wore a rough hair shirt beneath his clothing for years, afterward a small, constant, physically uncomfortable reminder of what he had done, and he observed an annual private day of fasting for the rest of his life in quiet memory of it. He went on to a long-respected career, eventually becoming one of the most senior judges in the entire colony, and even wrote one of early America's first published arguments against slavery. He carried Salem with him visibly for the remaining decades of his life, a walking, breathing reminder that at least one man on that bench never let himself off the hook. Here is a question worth sitting with. Two men sat on the exact same court, heard the exact same evidence, and signed their names to the exact same kinds of verdicts. One spent the rest of his life in some form of open penance. The other said nothing at all ever and simply went on living prosperous and respected until the end of his days. Which of those two responses do you honestly think is more common when ordinary people are asked to reckon with something terrible they helped cause? And which one would you trust yourself to choose if you were the one standing in that courtroom, instead of simply watching from 300 years away? One more apology from that era deserves your attention tonight, and it comes from a voice we have not heard from directly in quite some time. Anne Putnam, the young girl whose fits helped set almost this entire tragedy into motion, back at the very start of our story, was the only one of the original afflicted circle who ever publicly apologized for any of it. In 1699, both of her parents died within roughly 2 weeks of one another, leaving 19-year-old Anne suddenly responsible for raising 9 younger brothers and sisters entirely on her own. She never married. Her entire adult life folded itself around that single responsibility. 7 years later, when Anne wished to formally rejoin her church, the minister required her, as was customary, to publicly confess her past sins before the full congregation. She chose to use that moment to address the trials directly. Standing before a room that included surviving relatives of the very people she had once accused, including the family of Rebecca Nurse herself, she was read aloud as saying she'd been a childhood instrument of a great delusion, that she now believed with real conviction that those she named had been innocent, and that she carried genuine sorrow and guilt for the grief her testimony had caused. It was not a long statement. It did not undo anything. But it remains the only apology from any of the original accusing girls that history actually recorded. She died in 1716 at only 37 years old, having spent the back half of her short life quietly raising the family her parents left behind, and is buried today in an unmarked grave. The legal reckoning moved even slower than the personal one, dragging across generations in a way that is almost hard to comprehend from where we're sitting tonight. In 1702, the colony's General Court formally declared the trials to have been unlawful. In 1711, nearly 2 decades after the last hanging, the government finally passed a bill restoring the good names of 22 of the people convicted, along with a payment of restitution to their surviving families. It was by any measure an important step, the first real official acknowledgement that the colony itself had done something deeply wrong. It was also somehow still not the whole story. Several names were simply left off that 1711 list for reasons nobody bothered to fully explain at the time. Perhaps lost paperwork, perhaps families who had already scattered too far to petition on their behalf, perhaps simple bureaucratic carelessness, compounding an old injustice with a new one. It took until 1957, 265 years after the trials themselves, for the Massachusetts legislature to formally acknowledge a handful of the remaining victims. Even then, several names were still missing, unnamed and technically uncorrected, sitting quietly in the historical record, as though the state itself had simply lost track of exactly how many lives it still owed an apology to. It was not until the year 2001, on Halloween of all fitting dates, that the final 5 widely recognized victims were formally added to the record 309 years after they were executed. And even then, one single name still slipped through every version of that correction, for reasons historians still cannot fully explain, sitting there uncleared for 329 years until an 8th grade civics class in Massachusetts, more than 3 centuries after her conviction, finally noticed the gap and refused to let it stand. Her name was Elizabeth Johnson, and she was only 22 years old when she was swept up in the crisis part of a large extended family from Andover, the very town we spent time with earlier tonight, that saw nearly 30 of its own members accused before the panic finally burned itself out. Under pressure, she confessed the way so many people we have talked about tonight learned to confess because confession, as we discussed earlier, was the only reliable way to survive a trial like this one. Contemporary accounts describe her as somewhat simple-minded, easily overwhelmed by the pressure of the courtroom, exactly the kind of vulnerable, easily led defendant this entire system was built to consume. She was sentenced to death anyway. Governor Phipps's pardon arriving just in time is the only reason Elizabeth Johnson lived long enough to grow old, dying peacefully many decades later in her 70s, having somehow outlived nearly everyone else connected to this entire story. But when Massachusetts finally sat down centuries afterward to formally clear the names of everyone convicted, Elizabeth Johnson's name kept quietly falling through the cracks over and over across multiple separate attempts. She had no surviving children of her own to advocate on her behalf. No descendants left to write letters or petition legislators, the way other families eventually did for their own ancestors, generation after generation on behalf of people they had never met but still felt some quiet duty toward. Her own mother confusingly shared the exact same name, and had also been convicted, which appears to have muddled the record further over the centuries, each new legislative attempt at correction somehow managing to miss her yet again. By the 21st century, she was, as far as anyone could tell, the very last person convicted during the entire Salem crisis, whose name had never once been formally cleared, an entire wrongful conviction simply sitting there, forgotten because nobody alive still had a personal reason to remember her. That changed because of a middle school civics class in North Andover, Massachusetts. A teacher named Carrie Lapierre was walking her 8th grade students through a lesson on how laws actually get made, and rather than teach the process abstractly, she challenged them to find a real living injustice and try to fix it themselves. The students went looking through old records and found Elizabeth Johnson still technically a convicted witch, still legally guilty 329 years after her trial. Those students spent months on it. They researched her case, drafted actual legislation, and worked with a real state senator to introduce it formally before the Massachusetts legislature. In May of 2022, that bill passed. Elizabeth Johnson's name was finally formally cleared, not by a professional historian, not by a descendant with money and influence, but by a group of 13 and 14-year-olds who simply noticed that an old wrong was still sitting there unfinished and decided that was worth doing something about. Here is a question I want to leave you with before we move into the very last part of tonight's journey together. It took Massachusetts 329 years, Connecticut 376, and Virginia exactly 3 centuries to finally say the words we heard tonight out loud on the record. You were innocent. We were wrong. What does it tell you that it so often takes children rather than institutions to finally notice the debts a society has quietly stopped bothering to pay? Because if there is one thread running underneath everything we have uncovered together across this entire story, it might be this. Salem never really ended in 1693. It only ever went quiet for a while, waiting patiently for someone willing to look directly at it again. And that is exactly the thread I want to pull on next, because the truth is this story did not stay locked inside one small Massachusetts village at all. It became something else entirely, something that still shapes the way we talk about fear and blame and mob justice right up to this very night. Here is where that thread actually leads, and I think it might be the most quietly remarkable part of this entire night. For a long stretch of the 20th century, Salem's story sat mostly forgotten outside of New England itself, a strange local legend more than a national one, the kind of thing tucked into a single paragraph of a history textbook, and rarely mentioned again. Then, in the early 1950s, an American playwright sat down with an old book about the trials and found something in it he could not stop thinking about because it looked uncomfortably familiar. The country around him at that exact moment was living through its own smaller version of the same nightmare. In the years following the Second World War, a wave of fear about communist infiltration swept across the United States, driven partly by a congressional body called the House Un-American Activities Committee, and partly by a single ambitious senator whose name would eventually become its own kind of shorthand for the entire era. Writers, actors, directors, teachers, and government workers found themselves publicly accused of secret communist sympathies, often based on nothing sturdier than a rumour, an old signature on a petition, or the word of a single frightened colleague desperate to protect their own career. Reputations were destroyed in a single afternoon of testimony. People lost their jobs, their friendships, sometimes their entire professional lives over accusations that were in practice almost impossible to disprove. The same fundamental problem we sat with earlier tonight, when we talked about spectral evidence, an accusation nobody could actually see, weighed against a defense nobody could actually mount. Does any of that sound even a little familiar to you by now after everything we've spent this whole night walking through together? A playwright named Arthur Miller certainly thought so. Around this same period, a near friend and longtime collaborator of his testified before that same congressional committee, and under enormous pressure, agreed to name other people he suspected of communist ties, effectively trading their reputations to protect his own career. Miller was heartbroken by it and furious, and he found himself thinking constantly about the exact machinery that could pressure a good man into betraying his own friends to survive. Around that same time, almost by chance, he happened to pick up an old historical account of the Salem Witch Trials. Reading through it, he later wrote that he suddenly saw the entire shape of what was happening around him, reflected back at him from 260 years earlier, what he once described as the poetry hiding inside a hunt like this one, the strange, terrible rhythm of fear looking for somewhere to land. In 1953, Miller published a play based on that history, calling it The Crucible. On its surface, it told the story we have spent this entire night unpacking together in his own dramatized, partly fictionalized version, with names borrowed from real people and events rearranged and compressed for the stage. Underneath that surface, nearly everyone watching it in a theatre at the time understood exactly what it was actually about, and the play landed with the kind of force that only comes from an audience recognizing its own reflection. Here is the detail I find almost too poetic to be real, though I promise you it is. 3 years after that play opened in 1956, Arthur Miller himself was subpoenaed to testify before that very same congressional committee. He was asked directly to name other writers he had once attended meetings with. And Miller, the man who had just spent years writing about people choosing between confessing a lie to save themselves or standing firm and accepting the consequences, found himself facing the exact same choice in real life under oath with his own career and freedom on the line in a hearing room instead of a stage. He refused to name anyone. He told the committee plainly that he could speak honestly about his own actions, but that naming another person would only bring trouble down on someone who had done nothing wrong at all. He was convicted of contempt of Congress for it, fined, and given a suspended prison sentence. And in a small, almost darkly comic footnote to all of this, historical records suggest the committee's chairman quietly signalled that the entire hearing might simply be cancelled if Miller's soon-to-be wife, a rather famous actress named Marilyn Monroe, agreed to pose for a single photograph with him. Miller declined that offer too. The hearing went ahead exactly as scheduled and cost him a considerable sum in legal fees before it was finally settled. I want you to notice something about how this story actually ends, though, because I think it matters. Miller's conviction was overturned on appeal 2 years later. The very same country capable of putting a man on trial for refusing to betray his friends also eventually corrected itself slowly and imperfectly, the way we watched Massachusetts eventually try to correct itself as well, generation after generation, right up through that 8th grade classroom we left off with a little earlier tonight. Remember the pattern we uncovered together all the way back near the beginning of this story. In 1692, confessing and naming others was the only reliable way to survive Salem's court. Denying the charge standing on your own innocence was the choice most likely to get you hanged. Nearly 260 years later, an American writer sat in front of a different kind of court, facing a strikingly similar choice, offered the exact same bargain in slightly newer clothing, and this time chose differently and lived to keep writing anyway. That, I think, is not nothing. It might even be a kind of quiet, hard-won progress, even if it took centuries and even if it still cost him something real to get there. The phrase itself, witch hunt, slipped fully into everyday language somewhere around that same era, and it has never really left since. You will still hear it today reached for by people across almost every corner of public life, describing almost every kind of accusation you can imagine, often by people who agree on very little else, sometimes aimed in completely opposite directions within the very same week. I am not going to spend tonight telling you which of those modern uses are fair and which ones are not, because that is not actually the point of this story, and I think you are more than capable of weighing that for yourself with everything you now understand about where the phrase actually came from. What I do think is worth noticing is simply this: a phrase born out of one small terrified village in 1692 has somehow stayed useful, stayed necessary, stayed reached for across 330 years of human history since. We keep needing the words, because we apparently keep needing to describe the same underlying shape of fear again and again in new clothing, in every single generation on every single continent, where people are frightened enough to stop asking hard questions. So let's bring it all the way back home now, one final time, because I think you have earned a proper ending to everything we have walked through together tonight. We started in a cold kitchen in January with 2 little girls and a doctor who had no better explanation than an evil hand. A small private frightened moment that nobody in that parsonage could have possibly known would eventually claim 19 lives. We found the war on the frontier bleeding quietly into a village that had no idea it was already carrying that fear inside it. Refugees like Mercy Lewis carrying trauma nobody around them had a name for yet. We watched a village already at war with itself, 2 families, one bitter argument over land and money, and an underpaid minister stretched across an entire generation until it finally found somewhere terrible to land. We met 3 women who were the easiest, safest people in the entire village to blame: first a homeless beggar, a sick and absent churchgoer, and an enslaved woman whose survival instincts saved her own life while dooming so many others. We took apart the burning and discovered a rope and a tree and a rediscovered execution site sitting a short walk from a modern drugstore. We took apart the idea that only women were ever hunted and met a farmer, a constable, and a minister whose own strength and reputation helped build the very case against him. We took apart the idea that Salem stood alone and found an entire town called Andover that outdid it, and a woman named Alce Young hanged in Connecticut nearly half a century earlier, and a farm in Virginia where a woman floated in a river 14 years after Salem's own court finally closed its doors. We took apart the comforting notion that the whole thing could be blamed on a bad batch of bread and found, underneath that appealing theory, nothing sturdier than wishful thinking dressed up in the language of science. We walked into the actual courtroom, met the judges who built it out of nothing in 6 short weeks, and sat with Rebecca Nurse and Sarah Good and Bridget Bishop, while an entire community convinced itself that murder was righteousness, one signed warrant at a time. And then we watched that same community spend the next 3 centuries slowly, unevenly, sometimes shamefully late, trying to find its way back to something like honesty about all of it, through a judge in a hair shirt, a grown woman finally naming her own childhood guilt out loud, and a classroom full of teenagers who refuse to let one final name stay forgotten. If there is one single thread holding every part of tonight's story together, I think it is this. Fear left alone with no honest place to go will always eventually go looking for someone to blame. It does not need real evidence. It barely needs a plausible story. It only needs a community willing to stop asking hard questions, and enough people convinced that cruelty this time is somehow justified. That happened in a Puritan meeting house in 1692. It happened again in a congressional hearing room in the 1950s. And if you are paying careful attention to your own world tonight, you've probably already noticed it happening in some smaller, quieter shape somewhere near you as well. I do not say that to frighten you right before bed of all times. I say it because I think the antidote to all of it turned out to be sitting inside this story the entire time too. A judge willing to stand up in his own church and admit he was wrong, wearing the discomfort of that choice quite literally against his own skin for the rest of his life. A young woman willing to stand before a room full of people she had once hurt and finally say the words out loud. A group of teenagers willing to spend months of their own free time fixing a mistake nobody alive even remembered making. A playwright willing to lose money and reputation rather than hand over a friend's name to strangers who had no right to ask for it. None of them undid the original harm. Nothing ever really could. But every single one of them proved in their own quiet way that the story does not have to end exactly where the fear first left it. If you take only one thing to sleep with you tonight, let it be this. The people who lived through Salem in 1692 were not especially foolish, or especially cruel, or especially different from any of us watching this right now. They prayed. They worked hard. They loved their families and worried about their harvests and tried their best by their own lights to be good and faithful people. They were also frightened and tired and surrounded by neighbours who all seemed just as certain as they were. That is precisely what should stay with you tonight more than any single date or name we have covered. Not that something like this could only happen to people very different from yourself, 3 centuries and an ocean of assumptions away, but that it could, under the wrong combination of fear and silence and permission, happen almost anywhere to almost anyone, including us, including people who think of themselves as decent and reasonable right up until the exact moment they are not. Thank you honestly for spending this many hours of your night here with me, walking through all of it together from that first candlelit kitchen all the way to a classroom full of teenagers refusing to let an old wrong stay buried. If any part of tonight helped you drift off a little easier, or simply gave you something quietly interesting to carry into your dreams, instead of your own worries for a change that means more to me than you probably realize. And it is exactly why I keep doing this night after night, story after story. If you made it all the way to the very end of this one and it kept you company through even a portion of your night, I would love to hear which part stayed with you the most. Leave it in the comments whenever you wake up and feel like sharing. I read every single one, even the ones left at 3 in the morning, especially the ones left at 3 in the morning if we're being honest with each other. Rest well tonight, wherever in the world you happen to be listening from. Shut your eyes, let this one settle, and let the rest of your night be quiet. and I will see you again very soon with another story waiting patiently in the dark for us to tell together.